The most desired CEO thought his money would impress her, but when he saw the black woman couldn't care less, he fell for her harder than he ever imagined. But before we dive into the full story, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Now subscribe to the channel and let's get started. The air in the 52nd floor executive suite of Blackwood Industries felt different today. Alexander Blackwood noticed it the moment he stepped off his private elevator. The usual hushed reverence that accompanied his arrival was disrupted by an unfamiliar voice, confident, melodic, and distinctly unimpressed. Alexander paused, his Italian leather shoes sinking into the plush carpet as he adjusted his custom-made suit jacket. At 42, he had built an empire that spanned continents, commanding respect and fear in equal measure. The voice rounding the corner belonged to someone who apparently hadn't received that memo. "I understand your concerns, Mr. Palmer, but my answer remains the same. My community center is not for sale, regardless of how many zeros you add to the check." Alexander watched as his VP of Acquisitions, James Palmer, emerged from the conference room trailing behind a woman whose presence seemed to fill the hallway. She was tall, with close-cropped natural hair that framed a face with high cheekbones and eyes that burned with conviction. Her attire, a simple yellow wrap dress that complemented her deep brown skin, was a stark contrast to the sea of gray and navy suits that typically populated this floor. "Ms. Hayes, please reconsider. Blackwood Industries is prepared to make a very generous donation to relocate your center," Palmer was saying, desperation evident in his voice. Alexander knew that tone. Palmer used it when a deal was slipping through his fingers. "My center serves over 200 children from Westbrook. Children who can walk there after school. Children whose parents can reach it by public transit. Your generous donation doesn't account for that," she responded, never breaking stride as she headed toward the elevator. "And frankly, I'm not interested in being the black woman who sold out her community so another luxury high-rise could displace families who've lived there for generations." Alexander found himself stepping forward before he'd made a conscious decision to intervene. "Mr. Palmer," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had become his trademark, "I believe the meeting is concluded." Both Palmer and the woman stopped. His VP looked relieved at the interruption, while the woman regarded Alexander with cool assessment. No flicker of intimidation or awe crossed her features, a response so foreign in his presence that Alexander felt momentarily disoriented. "Mr. Blackwood," Palmer began, "this is Zora Hayes, director of the Westbrook Community Center. We were just discussing the Riverside Development Project." "I heard," Alexander replied, his eyes never leaving the woman's face. "Ms. Hayes, I apologize if my company has been overzealous in its approach." "Overzealous?" she echoed, raising an eyebrow. "Is that what we're calling it when you send increasingly aggressive representatives to my office 3 times in 2 weeks? When you attempt to pressure our landlord? When you try to turn community board members against me with promises of revitalization that conveniently excludes current residents?" Alexander felt a ripple of surprise. Few people spoke to him with such directness. "Those tactics weren't authorized by me personally, but as CEO, I take responsibility. Perhaps we could discuss this further. My office is just down the hall." Zora Hayes checked her watch, a simple timepiece with a worn leather band, not the status symbol he might have expected from someone unafraid to challenge him. "I've already spent more time here than I planned. I have a grant proposal due tomorrow and 20 teenagers expecting me to help them with college applications this afternoon." The dismissal was so matter-of-fact that Alexander almost smiled. Here was someone whose priorities clearly didn't include impressing him. "Then allow me to accompany you downstairs. We can talk on the way." She looked ready to refuse, then seemed to recalculate. "Fine. The elevator ride is exactly 62 seconds. Make your pitch." As the elevator doors closed behind them, leaving Palmer behind, Alexander found himself unusually conscious of his posture, of the space between them in the confined cabin. The subtle scent of her perfume, something with notes of vanilla and amber, mingled with the elevator's leather and polished wood. 61 seconds, Zora prompted, watching the numbers begin their descent. The Riverside development is important to this company, Alexander began, but I'm willing to reconsider our approach. Would you be open to showing me your community center? I'd like to understand what we'd be displacing before making any final decisions. She studied him, skepticism evident in her gaze. You want to visit Westbrook? When was the last time you set foot in a neighborhood where your net worth exceeds the combined value of every property on the block? Is that a prerequisite for visiting? No, but awareness of the disparity might be useful, she replied. Why would you come personally? To offer me more money face to face, thinking your famous charm might succeed where your minions failed. The elevator chimed as they passed the 30th floor. Alexander felt an unfamiliar sensation in his chest. The challenge of her question demanded honesty, not the practiced responses he typically deployed. Partially, he admitted, but also because you've made me curious. Not many people walk into this building and stand their ground the way you have. I'd like to understand what drives that conviction. Zora's expression softened slightly, though wariness remained. Tuesday, 4 p.m. We're having our STEM program for middle schoolers. You might learn something. The elevator reached the lobby, and the doors slid open. And Mr. Blackwood? Leave the suit at home. You'll terrify the children. With that, she stepped out, moving through the marble-floored lobby with purposeful strides. Alexander remained in the elevator, watching her retreating figure with an unexpected sense of anticipation. The doors began to close and he reached out to stop them, suddenly not ready to end this encounter. "Ms. Hayes," he called after her. She paused, turning slightly. "What should I wear instead?" A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Something you wouldn't mind getting marker stains on." Then she was gone, disappearing through the revolving doors into the bustling street beyond. Alexander let the elevator doors close, pressing the button for the 52nd floor. As the cabin ascended, he caught his reflection in the polished brass panel, the composed, controlled expression he'd perfected over years in boardrooms. But there was something different in his eyes now, something that looked remarkably like interest. When the doors opened, Palmer was waiting, a folder clutched in his hands and anxiety etched across his features. "Sir, about the Hayes situation. Put the Riverside development on hold," Alexander interrupted, continuing toward his office. Palmer hurried to keep pace. "On hold? But we've already invested millions in preliminary work. The board expects me to make sound business decisions, James. And right now, I'm not convinced displacing that community center is one." He paused at his office door. "Get me everything we have on Zora Hayes and the Westbrook Center, and find out what people wear to work with middle school children." "Sir, you heard me." Alexander entered his office, closing the door on his bewildered VP. Alone, he moved to the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city he'd helped shape. Somewhere out there, beyond the gleaming skyscrapers and luxury apartments that bore his company's imprint, was Westbrook, a neighborhood he'd only seen as colored shapes on development maps. And in it, a woman who had just done the unthinkable. She'd made Alexander Blackwood question his plans. He smiled to himself. Tuesday at 4 p.m. He'd be there. 3 days later, Alexander's driver, Marcus, gave him a questioning look through the rearview mirror as they pulled up half a block from the Westbrook Community Center. "You sure about this location, sir?" Marcus asked, eyeing the graffiti-covered walls of a nearby building and the group of teenagers lounging on a stoop across the street. Alexander glanced down at his attire, dark jeans and a charcoal Henley, both designer but understated. He'd left his watch and cufflinks at home. "Yes, Marcus. I have a meeting. Wait here, please." The community center occupied the first floor of an aging brick building wedged between a laundromat and a convenience store. A hand-painted sign proclaimed, "Westbrook Community Center, Growing Minds, Building Futures." Through the windows, Alexander could see children of various ages engaged in different activities. He pushed open the door, and the controlled chaos of the center enveloped him. A dozen middle schoolers huddled around tables covered with what appeared to be robotics kits. Near the back, older teenagers worked at computers. Along one wall, younger children were deeply absorbed in an art project involving an alarming amount of glitter. A young man with dreadlocks and a bright smile approached him. "Can I help you find something, brother?" "I'm looking for Zora Hayes," Alexander replied, realizing that for once he wasn't immediately recognized. A strangely refreshing experience. "Zora's in the science room with the STEM kids. Down the hall, second door on the right. They're building bridges today, so prepare for noise." Alexander followed the directions, pausing outside the doorway to observe. Zora moved between tables of excited preteens, her hands animated as she explained something about structural integrity. She wore jeans and a simple black t-shirt with "Black Girl Magic" printed across the front in bold white letters. Her laugh, full-bodied and genuine, echoed through the room as a student's popsicle stick creation wobbled precariously. "That's actually perfect, Darnell," she exclaimed. "Now you can see exactly where the weakness is. How would you reinforce it?" The boy screwed up his face in concentration, then reached for more popsicle sticks and a bottle of glue. Zora nodded encouragingly before noticing Alexander in the doorway. A flicker of surprise crossed her features before she composed herself and approached him. "You actually came," she said, keeping her voice low enough that the students remained focused on their projects. "I said I would." "People in your position say a lot of things, Mr. Blackwood." "Alexander," he corrected, "and I'm not most people." A skeptical smile tugged at her lips. "That remains to be seen." She gestured toward an empty seat at a table where 3 girls were working together. "Since you're here, make yourself useful. They're trying to build a suspension bridge that can hold at least 10 textbooks." Before he could respond, she'd guided him to the table and made introductions. "Girls, this is Alex. He's going to help you for a bit while I check on the other groups." 3 pairs of eyes regarded him with curiosity. The oldest-looking girl, with beaded braids and serious eyes, pushed a pile of popsicle sticks towards him. "I'm Tiana," she said. "That's Jasmine and Kendra. Our bridge keeps falling down in the middle." Alexander sat down, rolling up his sleeves. "Let me see what you've got so far." For the next hour, Alexander Blackwood, whose signature was on contracts worth billions, found himself completely absorbed in popsicle sticks, glue, and the determined creativity of 3 12-year-old girls. When their bridge finally held 11 textbooks before dramatically collapsing, the triumphant high fives he received from his teammates felt oddly more satisfying than closing his last major acquisition. Across the room he caught Zora watching him, an unreadable expression on her face. As the session wrapped up and the students began cleaning their workspaces, she approached. "You surprised me. I half expected you to stand in the corner looking uncomfortable until you could make your pitch and leave." "I'm full of surprises," he replied, helping Tiana pack away the remaining materials. "So is this place. You're doing remarkable work here." "Save the flattery for your shareholders, Mr. Blackwood." "It's not flattery if it's true, and I thought we'd established that you'd call me Alexander." Zora checked her watch, that same simple timepiece he'd noticed before. "The kids are leaving soon. If you want to talk about the development, we can use my office." Her office turned out to be a converted storage closet at the back of the building, crammed with a desk, 2 chairs, and walls papered with children's artwork, award certificates, and community flyers. A small window provided the only natural light. "It's not the corner office on the 52nd floor," she said, noticing his survey of the space, "but it serves its purpose." "It has character," Alexander replied, settling into a chair that had seen better days. "Like its occupant." Zora closed the door, shutting out the cheerful chaos of the center. The small space suddenly felt even smaller with Alexander's commanding presence filling it. He sat with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to occupying the most important seat in any room regardless of its size or location. "I meant what I said," he began. "The work you're doing here is impressive." Zora leaned against her desk, arms crossed. "Thank you. Now tell me why Blackwood Industries is so determined to demolish it." Alexander appreciated her directness. In his world of careful corporate diplomacy, where people spent entire meetings saying nothing of substance, her bluntness was refreshing. The Riverside development is meant to revitalize this area, bring in new businesses, create jobs. "For who?" Zora interrupted. "Not for the people who actually live here. Your revitalization prices out families who've been in Westbrook for generations. Those luxury condos you're planning. Starting at what? $500,000? The median household income here is $35,000 a year." Alexander studied her, noting the passion that animated her features. "You've done your research." "I had to. Your company doesn't exactly advertise the collateral damage of its developments." She pulled a folder from a stack on her desk and handed it to him. "Displacement statistics from your last 3 major urban projects. Population demographics before and after. Small business closure rates." He opened the folder, scanning pages of meticulously compiled data. Most of his executives wouldn't have been this thorough. "Where did you get this?" "I have a master's in urban planning from Columbia. Before I ran this center, I worked for the city's community development office." A hint of a smile crossed her face at his evident surprise. "What, did you think I was just some community organizer running an after-school program?" Alexander closed the folder. "I think I've underestimated you, Ms. Hayes." "Most people do," she replied without rancor. "It makes it easier to exceed their expectations." The late afternoon sun slanted through the small window, catching the warm undertones in her skin. Alexander found himself noticing details he typically wouldn't register in a business meeting. The elegant curve of her neck, the tiny scar near her right eyebrow, the way her hands moved expressively as she spoke. "Tell me about the center," he said, deliberately shifting the conversation. "How long have you been here?" If she was surprised by the change in topic, she didn't show it. 5 years. Before that, it was barely functioning. Just a place kids could go after school so they wouldn't be home alone. I wrote grants, built partnerships with local businesses and universities. Now we have STEM programs, college prep, arts, mentoring, adult education classes in the evenings. Pride colored her voice. 90% of our high school seniors get accepted to college. 75% are first-generation college students. "Impressive," Alexander nodded. "And what brought you here? With your credentials, you could have worked anywhere." Zora hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. "I grew up 6 blocks from here. My mother worked 2 jobs. This center, a much earlier version of it, is where I went after school. A volunteer helped me with my college applications, drove me to campus visits. Without this place," she shrugged, "I'm just paying it forward." The simple sincerity of her answer resonated unexpectedly with Alexander. In his world, motivations were rarely so straightforward or selfless. "And now, Blackwood Industries wants to tear it down for luxury condos," she concluded, bringing them back to the reason for his visit. "Not necessarily," Alexander replied. "That's why I'm here, to understand what would be lost." "And now that you've seen it? Built bridges with middle schoolers? Gotten a glimpse of what happens here?" He met her challenging gaze. "I'm reconsidering our approach." Zora's eyebrows rose slightly. "Just like that? I'm the CEO. I can make these decisions." "And your board? Your shareholders? The partners who've already invested in this development?" Alexander smiled. "Let me worry about them." She studied him, skepticism evident. "Why would you walk away from a multi-million-dollar development because of one community center?" It was a fair question, one he wasn't entirely sure he could answer. There was something about this place, about her conviction, that had gotten under his skin. "Sometimes the spreadsheets don't tell the whole story," he said finally. "I built Blackwood Industries from nothing. My first priority was always growth. Bigger buildings, more prestigious locations, higher profits. But I'm at a point now where I can consider impact beyond the bottom line. And you expect me to believe that a man who's spent his career displacing communities like mine has suddenly developed a social conscience because he spent an hour building popsicle stick bridges? The challenge in her voice was unmistakable, but beneath it, Alexander detected a genuine curiosity. She wanted to believe him, even as her experience warned her not to. "No," he answered honestly. "I expect you to be skeptical. I would be in your position. But I am asking you to consider that people can evolve. Even CEOs." A knock at the door interrupted them. The young man with dreadlocks who had greeted Alexander earlier poked his head in. "Sorry to interrupt, Z, but Ms. Gladys is here for the senior citizen computer class, and she's asking about that printer issue again." Zora sighed. "Tell her I'll be right there, Marcus." As her colleague withdrew, she turned back to Alexander. "Duty calls. Our evening programs are starting." He rose, suddenly reluctant to end their conversation. "Perhaps we could continue this discussion over dinner?" The invitation seemed to catch her off guard. "Dinner?" "Yes, a meal typically consumed in the evening," he replied with a slight smile. "I know a place not far from here, Caribbean Fusion. The owner is from Trinidad." Zora hesitated, and Alexander could almost see her internal debate. "This isn't a date," she said finally. "It's a continuation of our business discussion." "Of course," he agreed, though a part of him felt an inexplicable disappointment at her clarification. "And I need to finish up here first. Help Ms. Gladys with the printer and check in on the evening classes." "I can wait." She checked her watch. "It'll be at least an hour." "I'll help," Alexander offered, surprising himself. "I'm quite good with printers, actually. Built my first company repairing office equipment." The look of disbelief on her face was almost comical. "You, Alexander Blackwood, CEO of Blackwood Industries, want to fix our printer? Unless you'd prefer I observe your senior citizen computer class? Though I should warn you, my teaching skills may be limited to popsicle stick architecture." A reluctant smile tugged at her lips. "Fine. The printer it is." An hour and a half later, Alexander had not only fixed the ancient printer, but had also helped 3 senior citizens navigate email attachments and promised Ms. Gladys, a formidable octogenarian with purple-tinted hair, that he would look into donating newer computers to the center. As they finally left the building, Zora shook her head in amazement. "I still can't believe you just spent your evening doing tech support for our seniors. Don't you have empire building to do? Calls with Tokyo or something?" "Tokyo can wait," Alexander replied simply. He'd silenced his phone after the third urgent text from his assistant. Whatever crisis had emerged at the office could survive without him for one evening. The Caribbean restaurant was a small, vibrant space tucked between a barber shop and a convenience store. The owner, a jovial man named Calvin, greeted Zora by name and gave Alexander an appraising look before leading them to a table in the corner. "Friend of yours?" Alexander asked after Calvin had taken their orders and disappeared into the kitchen. "I helped his daughter get a scholarship to NYU," Zora explained. "Besides, this is Westbrook. Everyone knows everyone." As they waited for their food, Alexander observed how people kept stopping by their table. A teacher from the local high school, a mother whose son attended the center's programs, even the mailman who was picking up takeout. Each had a warm greeting for Zora, a quick update about a child or a community issue. She was woven into the fabric of this neighborhood in a way that made Alexander acutely aware of his own isolation, despite his prominence in the city. "You're like the mayor around here," he commented after the third interruption. Zora smiled, a genuine warmth lighting her eyes. "Community isn't just about living in the same place. It's about being invested in each other's lives. That's what your development plans don't account for. You can't quantify these relationships on a spreadsheet or replace them with amenities in a luxury building. Their food arrived: jerk chicken with coconut rice for Zora, curried goat for Alexander, and the rich, spiced aromas momentarily diverted their conversation. Alexander took a bite and found himself pleasantly surprised by the complex flavors. "This is excellent," he said. "How have I never heard of this place?" "Because it's not in Michelin guides or written up in the Times," Zora replied. "And it's in a neighborhood where men in $1,000 shoes don't typically venture." "My shoes weren't that expensive," Alexander protested mildly. Zora glanced under the table. "No? What are those then? They look Italian." "They are, but they were on sale." At her skeptical look, he added, "800, not 1,000. She laughed, a rich, unguarded sound that made heads turn at nearby tables. "You say that like it's a bargain." Alexander found himself smiling in response. "It's all relative, I suppose." As they ate, their conversation shifted away from the development in the center. He learned that she played saxophone in a jazz quartet on weekends, that she'd traveled through West Africa after college, that she kept a small garden on her apartment building's roof. In turn, he told her about his first failed business ventures before Blackwood Industries, about his collection of vintage motorcycles, about the cooking classes he'd been taking to combat his reliance on takeout. It struck Alexander, as they shared a dessert of rum cake with coconut ice cream, that this was the most honest conversation he'd had in years. As CEO, he was constantly performing, projecting confidence to investors, authority to employees, ruthlessness to competitors. With Zora in this small neighborhood restaurant, he was just Alexander. The realization was both unsettling and exhilarating. "Penny for your thoughts," Zora said, noticing his momentary distraction. Alexander hesitated, then decided on honesty. "I was just thinking that I can't remember the last time I had dinner with someone who wasn't trying to get something from me." Zora tilted her head. "I want something from you, to leave my community center alone." "True, but you're not pretending to be fascinated by my opinions on market fluctuations or laughing at my jokes because I sign your checks." "Your jokes aren't that funny," she deadpanned, then smiled to soften the critique. "See, refreshingly honest." Calvin brought their check, waving away Alexander's platinum card with a firm shake of his head. "On the house tonight. Any friend of Zora's is family here." Before Alexander could protest, Zora laid a hand on his arm. "Accept it gracefully. It's a gesture of community." The warmth of her touch lingered even after she withdrew her hand. Alexander nodded to Calvin. "Thank you. The meal was exceptional." As they stepped outside, the evening had grown cooler. Street lamps cast pools of light on the sidewalk, and the distant sounds of music drifted from open apartment windows. Alexander's driver, who had been circling the neighborhood, pulled up to the curb. "I should get home," Zora said, pulling a light jacket around her shoulders. "Early start tomorrow." "Let my driver take you," Alexander offered. She shook her head. "I'm only a few blocks away. I walk it every night." "Then I'll walk with you." Zora gave him a long look. "Alexander, this still isn't a date." "I never suggested it was," he replied, though the reminder stung more than it should have. "But it's after 10, and I'd feel better seeing you home safely." "I've been walking these streets safely for years," she pointed out, but her expression softened. "But if it will ease your privileged conscience, you can walk me home." They set off side by side, Alexander instructing his driver to follow at a distance. The neighborhood transformed in the evening hours. Lively conversations spilled from open windows. Groups of young men gathered on stoops. Music and cooking smells created a tapestry of sensory experiences so different from the sterile luxury of his own penthouse. "So," Zora said as they walked, "what happens tomorrow? You go back to your tower, put on a suit that costs more than most families here make in a month, and what? Tell your board you've had a change of heart about demolishing a community center?" The question brought Alexander back to reality. Tomorrow he would indeed return to a world of boardrooms and balance sheets, where decisions were driven by profit margins, not community needs. Essentially, yes, he answered, though I think I'll frame it as a strategic reassessment rather than a change of heart. Sounds more businesslike. Zora stopped at the entrance to a well-maintained but modest apartment building. And you think they'll just accept that? The Alexander Blackwood I've read about doesn't change course because of one site visit and a plate of jerk chicken. Alexander met her gaze steadily. The Alexander Blackwood you've read about is part of the story, not the whole. They stood there for a moment, the space between them charged with something neither of them was ready to name. "Thank you for dinner," Zora said finally, "and for fixing our printer. Ms. Gladys is already planning what she'll ask you to help with next time." "Next time?" Alexander echoed, unable to keep the hopeful note from his voice. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Well, you did promise to look into those new computers. And we have a broken air conditioning unit in the art room. Are you using your community center's maintenance issues as an excuse to see me again, Ms. Hayes?" "Absolutely not, Mr. Blackwood," she replied with mock seriousness. "I'm opportunistically leveraging available resources for the benefit of my community." Alexander laughed, a genuine sound that surprised them both. "In that case, I'd be delighted to be leveraged. For the community, of course." "Of course." Zora's smile softened into something more genuine. "Good night, Alexander." "Good night, Zora." He watched as she disappeared into the building, waiting until a light came on in a third-floor window before turning back to where his driver waited. As he settled into the leather-back seat of the Bentley, Alexander knew with unexpected certainty that the Riverside development as originally planned would never happen, not if it meant destroying what he'd witnessed today. What he was less certain about was why the thought of seeing Zora Hayes again made his heart beat faster than any business deal ever had. "You want to do what?" Richard Harmon, chairman of the Blackwood Industries Board, stared at Alexander as if he'd suggested they convert the company headquarters into a petting zoo. The boardroom fell silent. 14 pairs of eyes, belonging to some of the wealthiest and most influential people in the city, fixed on Alexander with expressions ranging from confusion to outright disbelief. Only Vanessa Chen, his longtime CFO and one of the few people he considered a friend, maintained her usual composed demeanor. "I want to redesign the Riverside development to incorporate the existing community center," Alexander repeated calmly, clicking to the next slide in his presentation. "We'll build around it, make it a centerpiece of the development rather than demolishing it." "That decreases our usable square footage by nearly 15%, objected Martin Reynolds, the oldest board member and the most resistant to any deviation from established practices. "The profit margins you projected were based on full utilization of that land." "I've recalculated the financials," Alexander replied, nodding to Vanessa, who distributed folders containing the new projections. "We'll make up the difference by adjusting the residential-commercial ratio and incorporating the center into our marketing. Luxury living with community engagement appeals strongly to the demographic we're targeting." It wasn't entirely untrue. The adjustments would preserve the center while still delivering a solid return for investors. What Alexander didn't say was that his motivation had less to do with marketing strategies and more to do with the way Zora's eyes had lit up when she talked about the children she mentored. "This is about that Hayes woman, isn't it?" The question came from Diana Blackwood, his cousin and the company's head of public relations. Unlike the others, she didn't look surprised, just calculating. "The community center director who's been making noise in the press about displacement." Alexander kept his expression neutral. "Ms. Hayes provided valuable insight into the community impacts of our original plan. Incorporating the center represents good corporate citizenship and potentially avoids negative publicity." Diana's perfectly shaped eyebrow arched higher. "I've seen her interviews. She's articulate, passionate, and photogenic. Bringing her on side would certainly help with the PR angle." She tapped her manicured nails against the table. "But is she willing to compromise? My team reports she's been quite inflexible," I'm handling Ms. Hayes personally, Alexander said, the words coming out more possessively than he'd intended. Diana's lips curved into a knowing smile that made him immediately regret his phrasing. I'm sure you are, cousin. Before Alexander could respond, Vanessa smoothly redirected the conversation. The financials support this adjustment. We're still projecting a 17% return on investment, which exceeds our benchmark for developments of this scale. The discussion continued for another hour, with Alexander methodically addressing concerns and objections. By the time the meeting adjourned, he'd secured tentative approval for the redesign, though several board members still looked skeptical as they filed out of the room. Vanessa lingered, waiting until they were alone before speaking. So, when do I get to meet her? Alexander looked up from gathering his materials. Meet who? The woman who's got you redesigning a $100 million development and calculating how many computers a community center needs. At his surprised expression, she smiled. Your assistant mentioned you asked for pricing on bulk educational computing equipment. Doesn't take a genius to connect the dots. It's not what you think, Alexander said, though he wasn't entirely sure what Vanessa was thinking, or if she was wrong. You spent yesterday evening fixing a printer and having dinner at a neighborhood restaurant instead of taking calls from Tokyo, she pointed out. In the 15 years I've known you, I've never seen you voluntarily miss a business call for anything less than a hospitalization. Alexander sighed. Zora, Ms. Hayes, is a remarkable woman doing important work. I'm simply ensuring our development doesn't undermine that work. Vanessa hummed skeptically. And the fact that she's the first person in years who wasn't impressed by your wealth or power has nothing to do with your interest? Has anyone ever told you you're insufferable when you're right? Alexander asked, a reluctant smile tugging at his lips. Only you, at least once a quarter, she replied cheerfully. Just be careful, Alex. Corporate America and community activism make for complicated bedfellows. Alexander's phone chimed with an incoming message, saving him from responding. His pulse quickened when he saw Zora's name on the screen. AC in the art room officially dead. Kids making "Help us, Mr. CEO" signs with melting crayons. Your move, Blackwood. Attached was a photo of a hand-drawn sign covered in colorful, slightly misshapen letters. Alexander found himself smiling as he typed a response. HVAC specialist will arrive within the hour. New AC unit tomorrow. Will children accept ice cream as interim solution? The reply came almost immediately. Ice cream always acceptable currency with under 18 demographic. Delivery of promised computers also good PR strategy. Computers ordered. Delivery next week. Installation included. There was a pause before her next message. Thank you. The kids will be thrilled. Another pause, then. Why are you doing all this? It was a fair question, one he wasn't sure he could answer honestly, even to himself. Instead, he typed, good corporate citizenship. Also, Ms. Gladys threatened me. Smart man, fearing Ms. Gladys. Deadlier than your board members. Alexander chuckled, then looked up to find Vanessa watching him with undisguised interest. Just business, he said unconvincingly, pocketing his phone. Of course, she replied. That's why you're smiling like a teenager who just got a prom invitation. Alexander ignored her, gathering his files. Don't you have a budget meeting to terrorize? I've got time to terrorize you first, she said, falling into step beside him as they exited the boardroom. Are you seeing her again? I'm visiting the center tomorrow to check on the new air conditioning installation, he admitted. Purely business. Right, Vanessa drawled. Because CEOs typically oversee AC repairs personally. She stopped at the elevator. Alex, I've watched you date socialites, models, and that one princess. I've never seen you smile at your phone like that over any of them. The elevator doors opened, sparing him from having to respond. As Vanessa stepped inside, she held the door, her expression turning serious. Just remember, she has her community's interests at heart, and you have your company's. When those interests conflict, and they will, what then? The question followed Alexander back to his office, lingering like an unwelcome shadow as he moved through his afternoon meetings. By the time he left for the day, the sun was setting, casting long shadows between the skyscrapers. On impulse, he directed his driver to Westbrook rather than his penthouse. The community center would be closed by now, but perhaps Zora... He stopped himself mid-thought. What was he doing? Showing up unannounced at her neighborhood like some lovesick teenager? He was Alexander Blackwood, CEO of one of the largest development companies in the country. He didn't chase after women, especially not women who had made it clear they weren't interested in anything beyond a professional relationship. "Change of plans, Marcus," he said to his driver. "Take me home." As the car turned toward his penthouse, Alexander's phone chimed again. Another message from Zora. "HVAC guy came through. Kids proclaimed you not evil like other rich people. High praise from Gen Z. Thanks again." Before he could respond, another message appeared. "Jazz quartet playing at Blue Note on Sullivan Street tonight at 9, in case you're interested in how community center directors spend their evenings." Alexander checked his watch. 8:15. He could make it if he went straight there. "Change of plans again, Marcus," he said, his decision made before he'd fully processed it. Sullivan Street, the Blue Note. The Blue Note was a far cry from the exclusive clubs and restaurants Alexander typically frequented. The small jazz venue was dimly lit, with tables packed close together and a modest stage where a quartet was setting up. He spotted Zora immediately, adjusting the reed on her saxophone, dressed in a simple black dress that hugged curves he'd noticed but tried not to dwell on during their previous meetings. He found a seat at the bar, ordering a whiskey and settling in to watch. When the quartet began to play, Alexander was transfixed. Zora transformed on stage, her body swaying with the music, her fingers dancing over the keys of her saxophone. The melancholy notes filled the room, telling stories of loss and longing that resonated in places he'd kept carefully guarded. During the break between sets, she spotted him. Surprise flickered across her face before she made her way through the crowd to where he sat. "Stalking me, Blackwood?" she asked, but her tone was light, almost playful. "You did mention you'd be here," he reminded her. "Consider it research. I'm learning how community center directors spend their evenings." She laughed, the sound somehow both familiar and thrilling. "And what's the verdict?" "That you've been hiding considerable talent. You're extraordinary." The compliment seemed to catch her off guard. She looked away, uncharacteristically flustered. "It's just something I love doing, a way to express things I can't put into words." "I could tell," he said softly. "Your music speaks volumes." Their eyes met, and for a moment the crowded club seemed to fade away. Then someone called Zora's name, breaking the spell. She glanced toward the stage where her bandmates were gesturing that it was time for the second set. "I have to go," she said. "But thanks for coming." Alexander nodded. "It's my pleasure, truly." He stayed for the entire second set, mesmerized by the way Zora poured her soul into the music. When the performance ended and the crowd began to disperse, he waited near the stage as she packed up her saxophone. "Can I walk you home?" he asked when she approached, case in hand. She studied him for a moment. "It's out of your way." "I don't mind." The night air was cool as they walked. The streets of Westbrook quieter now, but still alive with the occasional group of people, distant music, the hum of conversations from late-night establishments. "You're full of surprises, Zora Hayes," Alexander said as they strolled. "Urban planner, community director, saxophonist extraordinaire." She smiled, her face partially illuminated by a street lamp they passed under. "We all contain multitudes, even billionaire CEOs who fix printers and install air conditioning for underprivileged kids." "The AC unit was entirely self-serving," he insisted. "I was preventing a crayon-based uprising." Zora laughed, the sound echoing in the quiet street. "Smart strategy. Those kids can be ruthless with their protest signs." They walked in comfortable silence for a while. Then Zora spoke again, her tone more serious. I heard rumors today that Blackwood Industries is redesigning the Riverside development. Something about incorporating existing community structures rather than demolishing them. News travels fast, Alexander observed. It's a small community, and people pay attention when their homes and livelihoods are at stake. She stopped walking, turning to face him directly. Is it true? Yes, he confirmed. The plans are being adjusted to build around the community center. It will remain intact and operational throughout and after construction. Zora's expression was guarded, but he could see the cautious hope in her eyes. Why? What changed your mind? Alexander considered deflecting with another comment about corporate citizenship or marketing strategies. Instead, he found himself answering honestly. You did. What you showed me at the center, what you said about community not being something you can quantify on a spreadsheet, it made me reconsider our approach. Just like that? One visit to a community center changes years of corporate strategy? Sometimes it only takes one moment to realize you've been looking at things from the wrong perspective. He held her gaze. But it's not just about the center, Zora. It's about you. The admission hung in the air between them, more revealing than he'd intended. Zora took a small step back, her expression unreadable in the dim light. Alexander, she began, her voice gentle but firm. I appreciate what you're doing for the center, but if you're doing it because you think it will lead to something between us… That's not why, he interrupted, then reconsidered. Not entirely. Yes, I find you captivating, but the center's work stands on its own merits. Captivating, she repeated, a hint of skepticism in her voice. I'm sure you say that to all the community activists fighting your developments. Only the ones who play saxophone and call me out on my $800 shoes, he replied, attempting to lighten the moment. It worked. She smiled reluctantly. I can't get involved with you, Alexander. Our worlds are too different. Are they? He challenged gently. We both care about making an impact. We both have passion for what we do. We both apparently enjoy Caribbean food and jazz. It's more complicated than shared interests, and you know it. They had reached her apartment building. Zora paused at the entrance. You're the face of corporate development in this city, the very thing that threatens communities like mine. I'm also just a man, Alexander said quietly, one who can't stop thinking about you. The vulnerability in his admission seemed to catch her off guard. For a moment, he thought she might simply turn and walk away. Instead, she studied his face, her expression softening. This is a bad idea, she murmured almost to herself. Many great ideas seem bad at first, he replied, taking a careful step closer. Like community center directors befriending ruthless CEOs. Is that what we are? Friends? Alexander was close enough now to see the flecks of amber in her brown eyes, to catch the subtle scent of her perfume mingling with the lingering notes of the jazz club. I'd like to be, he said softly. For a start. Zora's gaze dropped to his lips for the briefest moment before meeting his eyes again. The air between them seemed charged with possibility. I should go inside, she said, though she made no move to leave. You should, he agreed, not stepping back. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then Zora leaned forward and pressed a gentle, fleeting kiss to his cheek. Good night, Alexander, she whispered, then turned and disappeared into her building before he could respond. Alexander stood there for a long moment, his cheek tingling from the brief contact. As he finally turned to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in his carefully ordered world, and that there would be no going back. The delivery of 20 new computers to the Westbrook Community Center became an impromptu neighborhood celebration. Children crowded around the gleaming monitors, marveling at technology that most schools in wealthier districts took for granted. Parents and community members stopped by throughout the day, drawn by excited phone calls and text messages spreading the news. Alexander, who had planned to simply oversee the installation and leave, found himself pulled into the festivities. He helped unpack equipment, set up workstations, and patiently explained basic functions to Ms. Gladys, who declared him not nearly as stuck-up as he looks on television. "You've made a lot of people happy today," Zora said, joining him as he finished connecting the last monitor. The computer lab, formerly a storage closet that had been hastily repurposed, hummed with excitement as children explored their new resources. Alexander straightened, taking in the joy around him. It was a stark contrast to the typical reactions his work elicited: shareholders pleased by percentage points, executives celebrating bonuses, politicians applauding economic development that often meant displacement for communities like this one. "It's just computers," he said modestly. "It's opportunity," Zora corrected. "These kids can now learn coding, create digital art, apply for colleges and scholarships online without having to wait hours for one ancient computer. You didn't just give them hardware, you gave them possibilities." Her praise warmed him in ways that business accolades never had. "I'm glad I could help. Though I'm still trying to figure out why," she added, her expression turning thoughtful. "This goes well beyond maintaining good community relations for your development." Before Alexander could respond, Tiana, the serious-eyed girl who had guided his popsicle stick bridge construction, approached them hesitantly. "Mr. Alex, can you help me set up my account?" she asked, holding a sheet with login instructions. "I want to start the coding program Ms. Zora told us about." "Of course," Alexander replied, grateful for the interruption. He wasn't quite ready to analyze his own motivations too closely, especially not with Zora watching him with those perceptive eyes. As he helped Tiana navigate the software setup, he was aware of Zora observing them, her expression soft in a way he hadn't seen before. When he glanced up, she quickly looked away, busying herself with another student. The afternoon slipped into evening, and Alexander was surprised to realize he'd spent the entire day at the center, the longest stretch of time he'd been away from his office in years. His phone had vibrated periodically with messages from his assistant and executives, but for once, he had let them wait. "You must have a mountain of work piling up," Zora commented as the center finally began to empty, parents arriving to collect their children, each stopping to thank Alexander for the donation. "Nothing that can't wait," he replied, helping her straighten the newly organized computer lab. "This was more important." She gave him a skeptical look. "More important than running your multi-billion-dollar company?" "Today?" "Yes." The certainty in his voice seemed to surprise them both. They worked in companionable silence for a few minutes before Zora spoke again. "My colleagues think I'm crazy for trusting you," she admitted. "They say you're just doing this for publicity or to smooth the way for your development." "And what do you think?" Alexander asked, pausing his work to face her directly. Zora considered him, her gaze searching. "I think you're more complicated than the caricature the media paints. I think you're genuinely trying to do the right thing, even if you're not entirely sure why." It was a surprisingly accurate assessment, one that Alexander wasn't sure he could have articulated himself. "Thank you for giving me the benefit of the doubt." "Don't make me regret it," she warned, but there was a warmth in her voice that belied the stern words. As they finished organizing the lab, Alexander found himself reluctant to leave. These hours spent in Zora's company, surrounded by the vibrant energy of the center, had been more fulfilling than any board meeting or corporate acquisition. "Have dinner with me," he said suddenly. Zora raised an eyebrow, again with the dinner invitations. "This time it's definitely a date," he clarified, emboldened by the memory of her kiss on his cheek 2 nights before. No pretense of business discussion. "Alexander," she began, hesitation clear in her voice. "I meant what I said about our worlds being too different." "Give me one evening to change your mind," he persisted. "One real date. If you still think it's impossible after that, I'll respect your decision." Zora studied him, conflicting emotions playing across her expressive face. Finally, she sighed. One date, but nothing extravagant or showy, no private jets to Paris or whatever ridiculous gestures men like you typically make. Alexander smiled, more pleased than he cared to admit. No private jets, I promise. Just dinner, something simple but special. Friday at 7, she agreed. Now go run your empire before your board stages a coup. Still smiling, Alexander gathered his jacket. At the door, he paused, looking back at the transformed center, at the new computers, the repaired air conditioning, the fresh paint they'd applied to the art room walls over the weekend. Small changes in the grand scheme of things, but significant to the people who used this space. And at the center of it all was Zora, watching him with an expression that suggested she was still trying to figure him out. Alexander realized with sudden clarity that he wanted her to succeed, wanted her to see past the CEO to the man beneath, a man he was only now beginning to rediscover himself. Friday at 7, he confirmed, his voice soft with promise. Wear something comfortable. The next morning, Alexander strode into his office with renewed energy and focus. The time away had given him perspective, and he tackled the accumulated work with efficiency, delegating where possible and prioritizing ruthlessly. Someone's in a good mood, Vanessa observed, dropping into a chair across from his desk during a rare break between meetings. The community center director must be quite something. Alexander didn't bother denying it. She is. We have a date on Friday. Vanessa's eyebrows shot up. An actual date? Not a business meeting or community engagement opportunity? An actual date, he confirmed. I need recommendations for somewhere special but not ostentatious. No private dining rooms or places where they close the restaurant for VIPs. So, basically nowhere you normally go? Vanessa teased. Then more seriously, you really like her, don't you? This isn't just about the challenge of pursuing someone who isn't impressed by your wealth. Alexander considered the question. No, it's not about that. She's different, authentic, passionate about her work in a way that reminds me of how I felt when I was building this company, before it became about the next acquisition or beating last quarter's numbers. Vanessa looked surprised, then thoughtful. That explains a lot about the changes I've been seeing in you lately. You've been more engaged, asking questions about community impact that you used to dismiss as PR concerns. Has it been that noticeable? To me, yes. To others, you're still the ruthlessly efficient CEO they expect. She smiled slightly. But I've known you too long not to notice when something, or someone, shifts your perspective. Alexander was saved from responding by his assistant announcing his next appointment. Vanessa rose to leave but paused at the door. Try Emilio's on 9th, she suggested. Small, family-owned Italian place. Amazing food, unpretentious atmosphere, no paparazzi lurking outside. The owner's daughter is in my cycling group. I can arrange a quiet corner table. Thank you, Alexander said sincerely. Vanessa nodded. Just be careful, Alex. Not everyone will be happy about this development. The ambiguity in her warning wasn't lost on him, but Alexander pushed it aside. He had a company to run and for the first time in years a personal life he was actually looking forward to. Friday evening arrived with unexpected nervousness on Alexander's part. He'd faced hostile takeovers and billion-dollar negotiations with less anxiety than he felt standing outside Zora's apartment building, dressed in dark jeans and a casual button-down shirt, holding a small gift bag. She emerged from the building looking stunning in a simple emerald dress that complemented her skin tone perfectly. Her hair was styled differently, softer, with tiny golden beads woven through the short curls, and she wore delicate gold earrings that caught the light when she moved. "Hi," she said, seeming almost shy, a contrast to her usual confidence. "Hi," Alexander echoed, momentarily at a loss for words. "You look beautiful," Zora smiled, the genuineness of his compliment apparently overriding her usual wariness. "Thank you. You clean up nicely yourself. She nodded toward the gift bag. What's that? Just a small thank you for agreeing to this date, he said, handing it to her. Inside was a vintage jazz record, one she had mentioned during their walk after her performance as being particularly meaningful to her. You remembered, she said softly, turning the album cover in her hands. I've been looking for this pressing for years. I have a friend who collects music memorabilia, Alexander explained. He helped me track it down. The way Zora looked at him then, surprised and genuinely touched, made his chest tighten with an unfamiliar feeling. Thank you, she said. This is thoughtful. I'm capable of thoughtfulness occasionally, he replied with a small smile. Shall we? He'd dismissed his driver for the evening, opting instead for a rideshare service, another deviation from his usual habits. The restaurant was just as Vanessa had described, warm, intimate, with brick walls and soft lighting, tables spaced far enough apart for privacy without feeling isolated. The owner, Emilio himself, greeted them personally and led them to a corner table partially secluded by a rustic wooden partition. No heads turned when they entered, no whispers followed them, a welcome change from Alexander's usual dining experiences. This is perfect, Zora said, looking around appreciatively. How did you find it? Vanessa, my CFO, recommended it, he admitted. I wanted somewhere we could just be ourselves. Conversation flowed easily as they shared antipasti and sipped wine from the restaurant's small but excellent selection. Alexander found himself talking about his childhood, growing up with a single mother who worked multiple jobs, learning early that security meant having enough money that no one could take away what mattered to you. So that's why you built Blackwood Industries? Zora asked. Financial security? Initially, yes, Alexander acknowledged. My mother died when I was in college. Cancer treatments she couldn't afford even working 60 hours a week. I promised myself I'd never be in that position of helplessness again. I'm sorry about your mother, Zora said softly, reaching across the table to briefly touch his hand. That explains a lot about your drive. What about you? He asked. You mentioned growing up near the center, but what led you back there after Columbia? Zora twirled pasta around her fork, considering her answer. I could have taken jobs that paid much better. Urban planning for private firms, consulting. But I kept thinking about the kids in Westbrook who were just like me, bright, capable, but without the opportunities that should be available to everyone. So you came back to create those opportunities? She nodded. My mother still lives in the neighborhood. She thinks I'm crazy for turning down respectable jobs to run a community center, but she volunteers 3 days a week teaching sewing classes to the teens. She sounds remarkable, Alexander said. Like mother, like daughter. A faint blush colored Zora's cheeks. Flattery will get you nowhere, Blackwood. It's not flattery if it's true, he countered, echoing her words from days before. As the evening progressed, Alexander realized he hadn't checked his phone once, hadn't even thought about work or deals or stock prices. Instead, he was completely present, captivated by Zora's stories, her laugh, the way she spoke with her hands when she was passionate about something. You're staring, she noted as they shared a tiramisu. Am I? Alexander didn't look away. I was just thinking how refreshing this is, being with someone who sees me as a person, not a resource or a stepping stone. Is that unusual in your world? More than I'd like to admit, he confessed. Most people want something from me. Funding, connections, the reflected prestige of being associated with the Blackwood name. Zora tilted her head. And what do you think I want from you? Nothing, Alexander replied simply. That's what makes you different. After dinner, they walked through a nearby park, the early summer evening perfect for strolling. Without conscious thought, Alexander found his hand entwining with Zora's, and to his pleasant surprise, she didn't pull away. I have a confession, she said after they had walked in comfortable silence for a while. I researched you pretty thoroughly when Blackwood Industries first targeted our neighborhood. Alexander smiled. I'd expect nothing less from someone as thorough as you. What I couldn't figure out from all the articles and interviews was why someone who started from nothing, who knows what it's like to struggle, would build a business that so often displaces people in similar circumstances. The question wasn't accusatory, merely curious, but it struck at something Alexander had carefully avoided examining too closely. I told myself I was creating progress, he said slowly, that neighborhoods like Westbrook would benefit from development in the long run. More jobs, better infrastructure, increased property values. But not for the original residents, Zora pointed out gently. No, he acknowledged. Not usually for them. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I think I lost perspective somewhere along the way. Success became its own justification. Zora squeezed his hand. It takes courage to admit that. They had stopped walking, facing each other in the glow of a park lamp. Alexander looked into Zora's eyes and saw neither judgment nor absolution, just understanding and a quiet challenge to do better. You're changing how I see things, he admitted. Not just about Westbrook or the development, but about what success really means. Is that a good thing? She asked, her voice soft. I think it might be the best thing that's happened to me in a very long time, Alexander replied, his thumb gently tracing circles on the back of her hand. The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility. Then, with a deliberateness that took his breath away, Zora stepped closer and lifted her face to his. Alexander leaned down, their lips meeting in a kiss that started gentle but quickly deepened with surprising intensity. When they finally broke apart, Zora's eyes remained closed for a moment longer, as if she was memorizing the sensation. When she looked at him again, there was a new vulnerability in her expression that matched the sudden tightness in his chest. I wasn't going to let that happen, she confessed, her voice slightly breathless. I'm very glad you changed your mind, Alexander replied, equally affected. They walked back toward Zora's apartment, hands still entwined, the comfortable silence between them now charged with awareness and possibility. At her building, they paused again. I had a wonderful time, Zora said, looking up at him with an expression both cautious and hopeful. Does that mean you'll consider a second date? Alexander asked, only half joking. The smile that spread across her face was answer enough even before she spoke. I think I could be persuaded. This time, when they kissed goodnight, it held the promise of something neither of them had been looking for, but had somehow found in each other, a connection that transcended their different worlds and challenged them both to see beyond their established perspectives. As Alexander walked away, he knew with certainty that whatever was developing between them would change everything, for his company, for her community, and most of all, for himself. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, he felt more alive than he had in years. News of Alexander Blackwood's involvement with the Westbrook Community Center spread quickly through both his corporate circles and Zora's neighborhood. Over the next few weeks, they settled into a rhythm that bridged their different worlds. Alexander attended community board meetings and helped with weekend programs at the center. Zora accompanied him to a charity gala where she charmed his business associates with her intelligence and wit. Most evenings found them together, exploring the city as if both were seeing it for the first time. Alexander discovered family-owned restaurants with food more satisfying than anything served at the Michelin-starred establishments he typically frequented. Zora reluctantly admitted that the symphony performances Alexander took her to moved her nearly as much as the jazz clubs she loved. But beneath the surface of their blossoming relationship, tensions simmered. Alexander first noticed it during a community meeting where the revised Riverside development plans were being presented. He'd sent his best architects and community liaison team, staying away himself at Zora's suggestion to avoid stealing focus from the actual plans. When he picked her up afterward, her expression was troubled. That bad? He asked as she slid into the passenger seat of his Audi. He'd taken to driving himself when they were together, another departure from his usual habits. The plans are beautiful, Zora admitted. Preserving the center, adding affordable housing units, space for local businesses. It's everything we asked for. Then why do you look like you're heading to a funeral? She sighed, fastening her seatbelt. Because half the neighborhood thinks I sold out. That I'm sleeping with the enemy, and that's the only reason Blackwood Industries suddenly cares about displacement and community preservation. Alexander frowned. That's ridiculous. The changes to the development plan are based on sound community feedback, not our personal relationship, which began conveniently right before your company had a dramatic change of heart, Zora pointed out. You can see why people are suspicious. Do you think that? He asked, his voice carefully neutral as he navigated through evening traffic. No, she answered without hesitation. I know you better than that. But Alexander, we can't pretend our relationship doesn't complicate things. He reached over to take her hand. I never said it wouldn't be complicated. I just said it would be worth it. The warmth in her eyes as she squeezed his hand confirmed that she agreed, at least for now. But the shadow of doubt had been cast, and Alexander couldn't help wondering if it would grow larger as the development progressed. The following week, Alexander waited outside the Blackwood Industries board meeting room while members reviewed the updated financial projections for the Riverside development. Vanessa had gone in to present them, insisting that Alexander's presence might be seen as undue pressure given the significant changes to the original plan. After 40 minutes, she emerged looking satisfied but cautious. They've approved the revised plan, she reported, though not without reservation. Reynolds abstained, and Diana had questions. Alexander could imagine the kind of questions his cousin had raised. Let me guess. She implied my judgment is compromised by personal interests? Not in so many words, Vanessa replied diplomatically. She did suggest that your sudden interest in community preservation might be temporary and asked what happens to the project when the novelty wears off. The insinuation rankled. My relationship with Zora isn't a novelty. I know that, Vanessa assured him. But Diana and some of the others see it as a potential liability. A CEO making major business decisions influenced by his girlfriend. This isn't about Zora, Alexander interrupted, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. It's about responsible development. The new plan still delivers solid returns while preserving an important community resource. Vanessa studied him with the frank assessment of a longtime friend. The old Alexander wouldn't have cared about preserving community resources if they stood in the way of maximum profit. Maybe the old Alexander needed updating, he replied with a wry smile. I agree, she said, surprising him. I like this version better, more balanced, but not everyone shares that view, especially shareholders expecting aggressive growth. The warning in her words was clear. Alexander's evolving perspective, influenced by his relationship with Zora, wasn't universally welcomed in the corporate world he'd built. Later that evening, Alexander and Zora strolled through a small farmer's market near her apartment. They'd fallen into a comfortable domesticity that still surprised him, shopping for ingredients, cooking dinner together in her modest kitchen, talking about their days while sharing a bottle of wine. Diana's questioning my judgment, he told her as they examined heirloom tomatoes at one stand. She thinks you're a temporary distraction affecting my business decisions. Zora selected a tomato, testing its ripeness with practiced fingers. And what do you think? I think you have influenced my perspective, he admitted, but not in the way they assume. You've reminded me that there are values beyond profit margins. She added the tomato to their basket. That's either growth or career suicide, depending on who you ask. She moved to the next stall, examining bunches of fresh basil. My colleagues at the center have similar concerns. Marcus suggested I'm being colonized by corporate America. Alexander couldn't help but laugh. Is that what we're doing to each other? Colonizing? Zora smiled. though her eyes remained serious. People fear what they don't understand, and a community activist dating a corporate CEO doesn't fit anyone's expected narrative. Maybe we need to rewrite the narrative, Alexander suggested, selecting a loaf of artisanal bread. Show them it doesn't have to be us versus them. Easy to say, Zora replied. Harder to demonstrate when power dynamics are so unequal. It was a sobering reminder of the realities that existed beyond their private moments together. No matter how equal they were as individuals, they operated in systems where the imbalances were stark and entrenched. The market vendor totaled their purchases. When Alexander reached for his wallet, Zora placed a hand on his arm. "My turn," she said firmly. He started to object. The total was negligible to him but represented a more significant expense for her, then stopped himself, recognizing the importance of this small assertion of equality. "Thank you," he said instead, accepting her gesture with grace. The smile she gave him suggested she understood exactly what had just transpired between them, a minor negotiation in the complex dance of navigating their different circumstances. As they walked back to her apartment, shopping bags in hand, Alexander's phone buzzed with an incoming call. He checked the screen and frowned. "I need to take this," he said apologetically. "It's Harrington." Zora nodded, taking the grocery bags from him. "Go ahead. I'll start dinner." He watched her continue toward the apartment building before answering. "Charles, what couldn't wait until tomorrow?" "A situation with the Riverside property," Harrington replied without preamble. "The owner of the convenience store adjacent to the community center is claiming he was promised first rights to commercial space in the new development. He's threatening to go public with allegations that we're favoring the center over other local businesses." Alexander pinched the bridge of his nose. "Who spoke to him? And what exactly was promised?" "That's the problem. He says it was you, last month when you were visiting the center. Something about ensuring neighborhood businesses wouldn't be displaced?" Alexander vaguely recalled the conversation, a brief exchange when he'd stopped to buy bottled water before meeting Zora. He'd assured the owner that the new development would prioritize existing local businesses, but had made no specific promises about commercial space allocation. "I'll handle it," he said to Harrington. "Set up a meeting for tomorrow morning, and tell legal to review the community benefit agreements we're drafting. I want to make sure we're crystal clear about commitments to existing businesses." After ending the call, Alexander stood for a moment on the sidewalk, watching as lights came on in Zora's third-floor apartment. 2 months ago, a situation like this would have been a minor annoyance to be delegated and forgotten. Now it represented the complex intersection of his professional responsibilities and personal relationships, a challenge he was still learning to navigate. When he reached the apartment, Zora had already started chopping vegetables, music playing softly in the background. She glanced up, taking in his expression. "Problem?" she asked. Alexander slipped off his jacket, rolling up his sleeves to help. "A misunderstanding with a local business owner near the center. Nothing that can't be resolved." She handed him a cutting board and knife. "Mr. Okafor at the convenience store?" "Yes," he confirmed, surprised. "How did you know?" "Small neighborhood," she reminded him. "He mentioned meeting you. Said you promised him space in the new development." Alexander carefully diced an onion. "I assured him we'd prioritize local businesses. I didn't guarantee specific space allocations." "But he heard what he wanted to hear," Zora observed, adding olive oil to a pan. "That happens a lot when people with power speak to people without it. Every word carries weight you might not intend." The insight gave him pause. "I've never thought about it that way." "Most people in your position don't have to," she replied, her tone matter-of-fact rather than accusatory. "When you've always had power, it's hard to recognize how your words and actions are interpreted by those who don't." Alexander absorbed this, recognizing the truth in her observation. "How do I fix it?" "Don't just send your lawyers or community liaisons to meet with him," Zora suggested. "Go yourself. Listen to his concerns. Involve him in finding a solution that works for everyone. The advice was simple but profound, treating the situation as a human problem to be solved collaboratively rather than a business issue to be managed. "This is why I need you in my life," Alexander said, setting down his knife to pull her into an embrace. "You see things I miss." Zora returned the hug but looked up at him with serious eyes. "I can't be your conscience or your community consultant, Alexander. That's not a sustainable basis for a relationship." "That's not what I meant," he assured her. "I value your perspective because it's yours, not because it's useful to my business." She studied him for a moment, then nodded, apparently satisfied with his sincerity. "Good. Now finish those onions before they make both of us cry." The moment lightened, but Alexander carried her words with him as they prepared dinner together. The boundaries between their professional and personal lives were blurring in ways that required constant navigation and reassessment. Later, as they sat on her small balcony enjoying the simple but delicious meal they'd prepared, Alexander found himself thinking about how much his life had changed in the short time since meeting Zora. His days were still filled with meetings and decisions involving millions of dollars, but his evenings, once consumed by networking events or solitary meals in his penthouse, now centered around this woman who challenged and completed him in equal measure. "What are you thinking about?" Zora asked, noticing his contemplative expression. "How different my life was before you," he answered honestly. "All the things I thought were important that now seem secondary." She set down her wine glass. "Alexander, I don't want you to change your life for me. That's not sustainable either." "I'm not changing for you," he clarified. "I'm changing because of what I've discovered through knowing you. There's a difference." Zora's expression softened. "Just be sure you're changing for reasons that will still matter if things don't work out between us." The possibility hung in the air between them, a reminder of the obstacles they still faced, the skepticism from both their worlds, the power imbalances they couldn't fully erase, the fundamental differences in their perspectives that no amount of mutual respect could completely reconcile. "Is that what you're expecting?" Alexander asked quietly. "For things not to work out?" "I'm a pragmatist," she replied. "And history suggests that relationships like ours face significant challenges. History also shows that sometimes challenges are overcome," he countered. "I'm not walking away from this, from us, because it's difficult." Zora reached across the small table to take his hand. "Neither am I. I just want us both to be realistic." As they sat together in the growing darkness, the city lights creating a distant constellation around them, Alexander knew that realism demanded acknowledging the complexities they faced. But something else, something that felt remarkably like hope, insisted that what they were building together was worth the struggle. The question that remained unanswered between them was whether that would be enough when the full weight of their different worlds inevitably pressed in on the fragile space they'd created together. The groundbreaking ceremony for the Riverside development should have been a triumphant moment. The revised plans, featuring the preserved community center as its heart, with affordable housing units and commercial spaces reserved for local businesses, represented a new direction for Blackwood Industries. Community input had been incorporated at every stage, environmental considerations prioritized, and displacement minimized through innovative housing solutions. Yet as Alexander stood on the makeshift stage erected at the edge of the construction site, he could feel the undercurrents of tension despite the smiles and handshakes. Mayor Tennyson was beaming for the cameras, praising visionary corporate citizenship, while carefully avoiding any mention of the years his administration had rubber-stamped developments that gutted neighborhoods like Westbrook. Board Chairman Harmon looked physically pained each time Alexander mentioned community benefits that might impact the profit margin. And at the edge of the gathered crowd, a small but vocal group of protesters held signs declaring, "Development seeks sheer displacement, and community not commodity." Zora stood in the front row, her expression carefully neutral. She had agreed to attend despite her reservations, recognizing the importance of her presence as both the community center director and Alexander's partner. But she had declined his invitation to speak, explaining privately that she couldn't publicly endorse a development that still troubled many community members, regardless of the compromises that had been won. And now, Alexander concluded his remarks, it's my privilege to invite representatives from the Westbrook community to join me in this symbolic groundbreaking, signifying our commitment to a true partnership in this development. Ms. Gladys, representing the Senior Citizens Association, stepped forward with surprising spryness for her 80-plus years. Mr. Okafor from the convenience store joined her, his earlier concerns addressed through a binding agreement that guaranteed him prime retail space at subsidized rates. Marcus, Zora's colleague from the center, completed the trio, looking slightly uncomfortable in the dress shirt Zora had convinced him to wear for the occasion. As cameras flashed to capture the diverse group wielding ceremonial shovels, Alexander caught Zora's eye. The small smile she offered him carried both support and caution, a perfect encapsulation of the delicate balance they'd been maintaining for the past 2 months. The reception afterward was held in a large tent set up beside the community center. Alexander mingled efficiently, navigating between corporate partners, politicians, and community members with the ease of someone accustomed to bridging different worlds. But his attention kept returning to Zora, who was engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with Diana at the far end of the tent. "Your girlfriend doesn't look happy," Vanessa observed, appearing at his elbow with 2 champagne flutes. She handed him one. "Neither does your cousin, for that matter." Alexander accepted the champagne but kept his eyes on the 2 women. "Diana's never approved of my personal choices." "This one's different," Vanessa pointed out. "You've never let a relationship influence business decisions before." "I haven't now," he countered, though without real conviction. They both knew that without Zora, the Riverside development would have proceeded according to the original plans, maximizing profit at the expense of the existing community. "The board is watching closely," Vanessa warned. "This project needs to succeed, Alex. Not just in terms of community goodwill, but financially. Otherwise—" She didn't need to finish the thought. Alexander was well aware of the whispers questioning whether his judgment was compromised, whether his relationship with Zora represented a conflict of interest that might jeopardize shareholder value. Across the tent, Diana said something that made Zora straighten her spine, eyes flashing. Alexander moved without thinking, cutting through the crowd toward them. "Ladies," he interrupted smoothly, "I hope you're enjoying the celebration." "Immensely," Diana replied with a razor-thin smile. "I was just telling Zora how remarkable it is that one person could have such profound influence on a billion-dollar corporation's strategy." Zora's expression remained composed, but Alexander could see the tension in her shoulders. "And I was explaining to your cousin that community activism has been influencing corporate behavior for decades. The only remarkable thing is that Blackwood Industries finally decided to listen." The subtle emphasis on the company name rather than Alexander personally wasn't lost on either of them. "If you'll excuse me," Zora continued, "Ms. Gladys is signaling that she's ready to leave. I should help her get home." Before Alexander could respond, she had slipped away, moving through the crowd with practiced grace. Diana sipped her champagne, watching Zora's retreating figure. "She's impressive, I'll give her that. Intelligent, principled, beautiful, I can see the appeal." "But," Alexander prompted, knowing his cousin rarely offered compliments without a sting in the tail, "but she's a liability, Alex. The board is already questioning whether you've lost your edge. Reynolds is openly suggesting that perhaps it's time for new leadership, someone who won't get distracted by community concerns at the expense of shareholder value." Alexander's jaw tightened. "Reynolds has wanted my job for years." "And now he thinks he has ammunition," Diana confirmed. "Be careful, cousin. This little romance might cost you more than you realize." She glided away, leaving Alexander alone with his champagne and the unsettling awareness that the professional consequences of his personal choices were beginning to materialize. The question was whether he still considered them a price worth paying. Later that evening, Alexander drove Zora back to her apartment, the silence between them heavy with unspoken tensions. "Your cousin doesn't approve of me," she finally said as they neared her neighborhood. "Diana doesn't approve of anything that might threaten her vision of what Blackwood Industries should be," Alexander replied. "Her ambitions have always been tied to the company's growth and prestige." "And I threaten that?" Alexander chose his words carefully. "You represent a different set of values and priorities. Diana views business through a zero-sum lens. Any concession to community interests must, by definition, reduce shareholder value." "And what do you believe?" Zora asked, turning in her seat to study his profile. "I believe that long-term success requires balance," he answered. "That companies can profit while still being responsible community partners." "Is that Alexander Blackwood speaking, or the man who's sleeping with a community activist?" The question was pointed but not hostile, a genuine inquiry about where his convictions truly lay. Alexander pulled up in front of her building and turned to face her. "Both. The CEO who sees the business value in sustainable, community-supported development, and the man who's fallen in love with a woman who's helped him remember what really matters." The word hung between them. Love, voiced for the first time. Zora's eyes widened slightly, her expression softening in the dim light of the car's interior. "Alexander," she began, her voice gentle but serious, "I care about you deeply. But I need to know that the changes you're making are authentic and sustainable, not just accommodations you're willing to make while we're together." "They're real," he assured her, taking her hand. "Would I have seen certain things sooner if we hadn't met? Probably not. But that doesn't make my commitment to this new approach any less genuine." Zora seemed to consider this, her fingers lightly entwined with his. "The protesters today, they're my friends, people I've worked with for years. They think I've abandoned our cause by being with you, that I'm providing cover for corporate interests to infiltrate our neighborhood more palatably." "And what do you think?" Alexander asked, echoing her question from months before. "I think—" She paused, searching for the right words. "I think I'm standing in the uncomfortable space where idealism meets pragmatism, where change happens incrementally rather than through revolution. And I'm trying to decide if that's a betrayal of my principles or the most effective way to honor them." Alexander understood that dilemma better than she might realize. He was occupying a similarly uncomfortable space, caught between the corporate imperatives that had guided his career and the evolving values that now informed his personal life. "Come upstairs?" Zora asked, changing the subject. "I don't want tonight to end with heavy questions we can't fully answer yet." In her apartment, they shed the weightier aspects of their discussion along with their formal clothes. There was a desperate quality to their lovemaking that night, as if they were both trying to reaffirm the connection between them as individuals, separate from the external forces that sought to define and divide them. Afterward, as they lay tangled in her sheets, Zora traced patterns on Alexander's chest with gentle fingers. "There's something I haven't told you," she said softly. "I've been offered a position at the Urban Justice Center, policy director for their community development program." Alexander propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at her with surprise. "That's an incredible opportunity. When did this happen?" "They approached me last week. The work would focus on advocating for equitable development policies citywide, not just in Westbrook." "You'd be perfect for it," Alexander said sincerely. "With your background in urban planning and your community experience, you could make a real impact at the policy level." Zora smiled at his immediate support, but her eyes remained troubled. It would mean stepping back from the day-to-day at the center, and she hesitated. It might complicate things between us even further. How so? The Urban Justice Center frequently opposes developments like Riverside, she explained. I'd be in a position where I might need to publicly challenge projects your company is involved in. Alexander absorbed this, understanding the potential for conflict. We've always known our professional lives would sometimes be at odds with our personal relationship. This would make it more direct, Zora pointed out. More visible. Do you want the position? He asked, focusing on what he believed mattered most. Yes, she admitted. It's a chance to shape policy, to prevent displacement before it happens rather than fighting it after plans are already in motion. Then you should take it, Alexander said without hesitation. We'll figure out how to navigate the complications. Zora studied his face, seeming to search for any reservation behind his words. Finding none, she reached up to touch his cheek. You continue to surprise me, Alexander Blackwood. Good, he replied, turning to kiss her palm. I'd hate to become predictable. The lightness of the moment belied the legitimate concerns they both harbored, but were choosing to set aside for the night. The truth was that Zora's new position would create professional situations where they would be directly opposed to each other. The careful separation they'd maintained between their relationship and their respective roles would become harder to preserve. Alexander's phone buzzed on the nightstand. He ignored it, but a second buzz followed immediately, then a third. You should check that, Zora murmured against his shoulder. It could be important. Reluctantly, he reached for the phone. 3 messages from Vanessa. Reynolds called emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. Topic: leadership concerns and strategic direction. This is a coup attempt, Alex. Be prepared. Alexander set the phone down, his body tensing involuntarily. Bad news? Zora asked, noticing the change in his demeanor. Potentially, he acknowledged. Board politics. Nothing for you to worry about. But as he pulled her closer, Alexander knew that the professional consequences Diana had warned about were materializing faster than he'd anticipated. Reynolds was making his move, using Alexander's evolving approach, symbolized by the Riverside development and, by extension, his relationship with Zora, as justification for a leadership challenge. Tomorrow, he would have to defend not just his position as CEO, but his entire vision for what Blackwood Industries could become, and he would need to do it without appearing compromised by personal relationships or shifting values. Zora's breathing gradually deepened as she drifted to sleep in his arms, unaware of the corporate battle looming. Alexander remained awake, staring at the ceiling, weighing strategies and considering alliances. The irony wasn't lost on him. In her bed, holding the woman who had helped him see beyond profit margins, he was plotting how to retain control of the company he'd built. The worlds they had been trying to bridge were colliding in ways that would soon force difficult choices for them both. Alexander arrived at Blackwood Industries headquarters at 6 the next morning, hours before the emergency board meeting. The massive glass and steel building that bore his name still slept, skeleton security staff nodding respectfully as he made his way to the executive floor. The emptiness of the normally bustling space gave it an almost liminal quality, a corporate cathedral awaiting its worshippers. In his office, Alexander methodically prepared for battle. He reviewed quarterly projections, pulled comparison data showing how his recent decisions measured against industry benchmarks, and outlined a vision for Blackwood Industries that incorporated both profit and community responsibility. He was halfway through his preparation when Vanessa arrived, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a grim expression. "I've been calling board members all night," she said without preamble, setting 1 coffee on his desk. "Reynolds has 6 solid votes, including Harmon." Alexander nodded. With 14 board members, Reynolds would need 8 to force a no-confidence vote. "Who's on our side?" "Parker, Chen, and Williams are with you. Fitzgerald and Michaels are undecided. Everyone else is leaning toward Reynolds." "Diana?" Vanessa hesitated. "She hasn't returned my calls." "Of course not. His cousin was too shrewd to commit openly until she saw which way the wind was blowing. Diana had always been a skilled political operator. It was what made her so effective as head of public relations. "What's Reynolds' primary argument?" Alexander asked, though he could guess the answer. "That you've lost focus on shareholder value," Vanessa confirmed. "That your personal relationship with a community activist has compromised your judgment. He's using the Riverside development as his primary exhibit, claiming the concessions will reduce returns below acceptable levels. Even though your revised projections still show 17% returns," Alexander noted, reaching for the financial models they'd presented to the board. "Projections can be questioned," Vanessa reminded him, "and Reynolds is arguing that this is just the beginning, that your approach signals a fundamental shift away from maximizing profit." Alexander leaned back in his chair, contemplating the irony. The very evolution he viewed as necessary for long-term sustainability was being weaponized as evidence of his unfitness to lead. "What's your strategy?" Vanessa asked, perching on the edge of his desk. "The truth," Alexander replied simply, "that responsible community engagement and solid returns aren't mutually exclusive. That my personal relationship with Zora has opened my eyes to opportunities I might have otherwise missed, but hasn't compromised my commitment to this company's success." Vanessa looked skeptical. "That's idealistic. It's also honest. And I built this company. These board members were handpicked by me. If I can't convince them to trust my vision, then maybe Reynolds is right about one thing. Maybe it is time for new leadership." The words were bold, but Alexander felt the weight of them. Blackwood Industries was more than just a company to him. It was his legacy, built from nothing after watching his mother struggle and ultimately die because she couldn't afford proper health care. The idea of losing control of it was almost physically painful. "You don't mean that," Vanessa said, studying his face. "No," he admitted, "but I'm also not willing to abandon my principles to keep my position. There's no point running a company if I don't believe in its direction." She nodded slowly. "Then we'd better make a compelling case." They worked together through the early morning hours, refining arguments and anticipating objections. By the time board members began arriving at 9, Alexander felt as prepared as possible for the challenge ahead. The boardroom was charged with tension as Alexander took his customary seat at the head of the polished mahogany table. Reynolds sat directly opposite, his thin face composed in an expression of regretful concern that didn't reach his eyes. Diana arrived last, taking a seat in the middle of the table, a physical representation of her uncommitted stance. "I believe we all understand why we're here," Reynolds began without preamble once the meeting was called to order. "Over the past quarter, there have been growing concerns about the strategic direction of Blackwood Industries and the leadership decisions that have guided that direction." Alexander remained silent, waiting. This was Reynolds's move. Let him show his hand first. "Specifically," Reynolds continued, "the Riverside development has become emblematic of a troubling shift away from our fiduciary responsibility to maximize shareholder returns. While community relations and corporate social responsibility have their place, they cannot come at the expense of our primary obligation to our investors." Several board members nodded in agreement. Alexander noted who they were, mentally tallying the votes. "Moreover," Reynolds said, his voice taking on a more personal tone, "there are concerns that Mr. Blackwood's judgment has been influenced by personal factors that may not align with the company's best interests." And there it was, the direct attack Alexander had been anticipating. Reynolds was too tactful to explicitly mention Zora by name, but everyone in the room understood the reference. "If I may respond," Alexander said, rising from his seat. All eyes turned to him. "Blackwood Industries has delivered consistent growth and returns under my leadership for 15 years. In that time, I've never asked this board to simply trust me without evidence that my decisions were sound." He activated the large screen at the end of the room, displaying the financial projections for the revised Riverside development. The modified plans still project a 17% return on investment, 2 points above our benchmark for projects of this scale. Projections based on assumptions that may be overly optimistic, Reynolds countered. Assumptions verified by 3 independent analysts, Vanessa interjected, passing folders to each board member, including Robertson Consulting, which this board has relied on for verification for the past decade. Alexander continued, advancing to the next slide. Beyond the Riverside project, our company-wide returns have averaged 22% during my tenure compared to an industry average of 16%. My track record speaks for itself. Your past performance isn't in question, Harmon said, speaking for the first time. It's your current judgment and future direction that concern us. My judgment is evolving based on new information and perspectives, Alexander acknowledged. As it should. The real estate development landscape is changing. Communities are more organized, more vocal in their opposition to projects that don't consider their needs. Fighting these battles project by project is costly and inefficient. He clicked to another slide showing data on development delays due to community opposition. What some of you perceive as concessions, I see as strategic adaptations that will position us advantageously in a changing market. For the next 30 minutes, Alexander methodically presented his case, emphasizing both financial performance and the strategic benefits of community engagement. Throughout, he was careful to frame his relationship with Zora as one factor among many that had influenced his thinking, significant, but not determinative. In conclusion, he said finally, I ask this board to consider not just whether Blackwood Industries will be profitable under my continued leadership, the data clearly shows it will be, but what kind of company we want to be. One that extracts maximum short-term value regardless of broader impacts, or one that builds sustainable growth while being a responsible partner to the communities where we operate. As he took his seat, Alexander felt cautiously optimistic. He had made a strong case, and several previously skeptical board members appeared thoughtful. Reynolds, however, was undeterred. A moving speech, he said, his tone making it clear he found it anything but. However, it doesn't address the fundamental concern many of us share, that your personal relationship with Ms. Hayes represents an ongoing conflict of interest that compromises your ability to make objective business decisions. Ms. Hayes has no formal role in any Blackwood development decisions, Alexander pointed out. She runs a community center that happens to be located in an area where we're developing. A community center that you specifically redesigned an entire project to preserve, Reynolds countered. And now I understand Ms. Hayes has been offered a position at the Urban Justice Center, an organization that frequently opposes our projects through litigation and public campaigns. The conflict of interest will only intensify. Alexander felt a chill. How had Reynolds learned about Zora's job offer so quickly? She had only told him last night. Before he could respond, Diana spoke for the first time. If I may interject, she said, all eyes turning to her. While I share some of Martin's concerns about potential conflicts, I believe there's a straightforward solution that doesn't require a leadership change. The room grew silent, waiting. Diana's position as a Blackwood family member gave her words particular weight. Alexander has always put this company first, she continued. I suggest we give him the opportunity to demonstrate that commitment by implementing a formal recusal policy. On any project where Ms. Hayes or her affiliated organizations have direct involvement, Alexander would delegate decision authority to an independent committee of board members. It was a masterful political move. Diana was offering a compromise that acknowledged the concerns while preserving Alexander's position, and, not incidentally, positioning herself as a reasonable mediator whose judgment could be trusted. That still doesn't address the broader strategic shift, Reynolds objected, recognizing that the momentum was slipping away from him. Which is precisely why we have quarterly board reviews, Diana pointed out smoothly. If the new approach Alexander has outlined doesn't deliver the projected returns, We can reevaluate then." The discussion continued for another hour, but Alexander could see that Reynolds's support was eroding. When the final vote came, 9 board members sided with Alexander remaining as CEO, subject to the recusal policy Diana had proposed. 5, including Reynolds and Harmon, voted against. As the meeting adjourned, Diana approached Alexander. "Don't mistake this for unconditional support, cousin," she said quietly. "You've been given a chance to prove your new vision works. Don't waste it." With that warning delivered, she left, her heels clicking precisely against the marble floor. Vanessa waited until the boardroom had emptied before speaking. "Congratulations on surviving the coup." "Thanks to Diana, of all people," Alexander said, still processing his cousin's unexpected intervention. "Diana recognizes that stability serves her interests for now," Vanessa observed. "But Reynolds won't stop pushing, and the recusal policy creates its own complications." Alexander nodded, gathering his materials. The policy meant he would have to distance himself professionally from any project Zora became involved with through her new position. A constraint that would become increasingly difficult to navigate as their careers and personal lives continued to intertwine. "Have you told Zora about any of this?" Vanessa asked as they walked toward the elevator. "Not yet," Alexander admitted. "She knows Reynolds was planning something, but not the details." "And will you tell her about the recusal policy? About how your relationship is being viewed by the board?" It was a fair question. Alexander had been deliberately vague with Zora about the corporate pressures he was facing because of their relationship, not wanting to add to her own conflicted feelings about their connection. "I'll have to," he said finally. "She deserves to know the full picture before she decides about the Urban Justice Center position." But as he rode the elevator down to the lobby, Alexander couldn't help wondering how Zora would react to learning that their relationship had become a corporate governance issue, that formal policies were being implemented to manage the potential conflicts it created. Would she see it as necessary pragmatism or as evidence that their worlds were fundamentally incompatible? More troubling still was the question of how Reynolds had learned about Zora's job offer so quickly. The information could only have come from someone connected to either Zora or the Urban Justice Center, suggesting that their relationship was being monitored in ways Alexander hadn't anticipated. As he stepped into the bright morning sunshine, his phone buzzed with a message from Zora. "Just accepted the UJC position. Starting in 2 weeks. Can we celebrate tonight?" Alexander stared at the screen, emotions warring within him. He was genuinely happy for her. The position was perfect for her skills and passion. But the timing couldn't have been more complicated, and the conversation they needed to have about its implications for their relationship had just become urgently necessary. "Absolutely," he typed back. "Dinner at my place? I have news to share too." Her response came quickly. "Sounds serious. Everything okay?" "We'll talk tonight," he replied, unable to adequately explain the morning's events in a text message. "And yes, we're okay. Just complications to navigate. At least he hoped they would be okay." But as he slid into the back seat of his waiting car, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that the careful balance they'd been maintaining was shifting beneath them, forcing choices neither of them was fully prepared to make. Alexander's penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of a sleek residential tower he'd developed early in his career. Unlike most of his properties, which he sold to other wealthy buyers, he'd kept this one for himself, designing it as a showcase of his success and taste. The vast, open-concept living area featured floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city, museum-quality art on the walls, and furniture selected by one of the country's most exclusive designers. Tonight, as he moved around the kitchen preparing dinner, Alexander found himself seeing the space through Zora's eyes. Would she notice that despite all its luxury, it didn't really feel like a home? That for all its impressive views, there was something sterile about its perfection? Zora had visited his penthouse only a handful of times, always seeming slightly uncomfortable despite her efforts to hide it. They spent most of their time together at her apartment, a space that, while modest, felt lived in and personal in ways his never had. The elevator's subtle chime announced her arrival. Alexander took a deep breath, wiped his hands on a kitchen towel, and went to greet her. She stepped into the foyer wearing a simple blue dress, her short hair adorned with tiny silver clips that caught the light. Even after months together, the sight of her still made his heart beat faster. "Something smells amazing," she said, accepting his kiss. "Coq au vin," Alexander replied, "from that cooking class I told you about." "Impressive," Zora smiled, following him into the kitchen. "So what's this news you needed to share in person? And why do you look like you've been strategizing all day?" Alexander poured her a glass of wine before answering. "There was an emergency board meeting this morning. Reynolds tried to force me out as CEO. Zora's eyes widened. "What? Why?" "Officially, concerns about the company's strategic direction. Unofficially, he believes my judgment has been compromised by my personal relationships, specifically my relationship with you." She set down her glass, her expression shifting to one of dismay. "Alexander, I never meant to create problems for you professionally." "You haven't," he assured her quickly. "Reynolds has been looking for an excuse to challenge me for years. He's using our relationship as a convenient pretext, not a genuine concern." "What happened at the meeting?" Zora asked, her practical nature focusing on outcomes rather than blame. Alexander outlined the morning's events as he finished preparing dinner. Reynolds' accusations, his defense, and Diana's unexpected intervention with the recusal policy. "So basically, they're implementing corporate governance rules specifically because of me," Zora summarized as they carried their plates to the dining table beside the windows. The city lights twinkled below them, creating a backdrop of artificial stars. "Because of us," Alexander corrected gently, "and it's a reasonable precaution given your new position. The Urban Justice Center often takes adversarial positions against developers like Blackwood." Zora's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "You know about that? I just accepted the offer this morning." "Reynolds knew about it before the board meeting," Alexander admitted. "That's part of what I needed to tell you. Someone is apparently monitoring our relationship closely enough to have learned about your job offer immediately." A shadow crossed Zora's face. "That's unsettling, but not entirely surprising. We're an unusual couple in many ways. People notice." "It's more than casual observation," Alexander said. "The timing suggests someone deliberately feeding information to Reynolds, someone with access to your professional discussions." Zora considered this, her analytical mind visibly working through the possibilities. "There are only a few people who knew I was considering the UJC position. My mother, Marcus, from the center, and the UJC directors who interviewed me. Any of them have connections to Blackwood Industries or Reynolds specifically?" "Not that I'm aware of." She took a sip of wine, her expression troubled. "Does it matter how he found out? The fact remains that your board now sees me as a liability to your leadership." "A manageable complication," Alexander corrected. "The recusal policy addresses the formal concerns. As long as I deliver on the financial projections, the board will come around to my vision." Zora didn't look convinced. "And what happens when the Urban Justice Center opposes a Blackwood development? When I'm quoted in the press criticizing your company's projects?" It was the question Alexander had been avoiding since learning about her job offer. Now, sitting across from her with the weight of the day's events between them, he couldn't pretend it wasn't a legitimate concern. "We'll handle it professionally," he said finally. "You have your responsibilities, I have mine. We've always known our work would sometimes put us at odds." "Not directly," Zora pointed out. "Not in ways that could make headlines or affect stock prices." The practical concerns she was raising mirrored Alexander's own private worries. But seeing her distress, he found himself wanting to reassure her rather than adding to her burden. "People navigate more complicated professional conflicts every day. he said with more confidence than he felt. "We're both adults capable of separating our work from our personal lives." Zora set down her fork, studying him with those perceptive eyes that seemed to see right through his practiced CEO composure. "Are we, though?" she asked softly. "These past months, the lines have been anything but clear. The Riverside development changed because of our relationship. Your board implemented a recusal policy because of it. My colleagues at the center question my objectivity because of my connection to you." "Are you saying it's been a mistake?" Alexander asked, a tightness forming in his chest. "No," Zora replied quickly. "What I'm saying is that pretending we can keep our professional and personal lives in separate, tidy boxes isn't realistic. We need to acknowledge the complications and be intentional about how we navigate them." She was right, of course. It was the kind of clear-eyed pragmatism that had drawn him to her from the beginning. "So how do we navigate them?" he asked, genuinely seeking her perspective. Zora took a moment before answering, her gaze drifting to the city spread out below them. "We start by being honest, with ourselves and each other, about what matters most to us, about our non-negotiables. You matter most to me," Alexander said without hesitation. Her expression softened. "And you matter tremendously to me. But Alexander, we both have purposes beyond our relationship. You built Blackwood Industries to create security and success on your own terms. I've dedicated my life to advocating for communities that lack power and resources." "Those purposes don't have to be in conflict," he insisted. "But sometimes they will be," Zora countered gently. "And when they are, we need to know where our boundaries lie, what compromises we can live with, and which ones would damage our integrity." The conversation had taken on a weight Alexander hadn't anticipated when planning this celebratory dinner. He had wanted to toast her new position, to assure her that they could weather the professional complications. Instead, they were confronting fundamental questions about their relationship's sustainability. "What are your non-negotiables?" he asked, recognizing that understanding her boundaries was essential to finding a path forward. Zora considered the question carefully. "I can't compromise my advocacy," she said finally. "I won't publicly support development projects I believe harm communities even if they're led by Blackwood, and I won't use my relationship with you to gain special access or concessions that other community advocates couldn't secure." Alexander nodded, appreciating her clarity even as he recognized the challenges her boundaries created. "And mine is that I won't make business decisions that threaten the company's long-term viability, even to support causes you care about. I believe in the vision of more responsible, community-engaged development, but ultimately I'm accountable to shareholders who expect returns." They sat with these declarations between them, neither speaking for several moments. The honesty was both necessary and painful, an acknowledgement that their love existed within contexts that couldn't simply be wished away. "Where does that leave us?" Alexander finally asked. Zora reached across the table to take his hand. "Exactly where we've been all along, trying to build something meaningful between two worlds that don't naturally align. The only difference is that now we're being more honest about the challenges." There was wisdom in her words, but Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that they were balancing on a precipice, with forces on both sides threatening to pull them apart. "I don't want to lose you," he said, the vulnerability in his voice surprising them both. "I don't want to lose you either," Zora replied softly. "But I don't want either of us to lose ourselves in the process of staying together." The remainder of the evening passed in a strange mixture of intimacy and uncertainty. They finished dinner, shared dessert, and eventually made their way to Alexander's bedroom, where their bodies communicated what words couldn't quite resolve. Their deep connection, their desire to bridge the gaps between them, their fear that external pressures might ultimately prove too strong. Later, as Zora slept beside him, Alexander lay awake watching the play of city lights across the ceiling. Something fundamental had shifted between them tonight. They had named the contradictions they'd been trying to ignore, had acknowledged that loving each other didn't automatically solve the real conflicts in their values, priorities, and responsibilities. It was a more mature, honest perspective, but it also felt more fragile, as if naming the challenges had made them more substantial. Alexander's phone vibrated on the nightstand. He reached for it carefully, not wanting to wake Zora. A message from Vanessa. Reynolds meeting with UJC board member tomorrow. Source says he's offering major donation with conditions. Watch your back. The implications were immediately clear. Reynolds was trying to create a direct conflict that would test the recusal policy and potentially force a wedge between Alexander and Zora. If Blackwood Industries became a major donor to the Urban Justice Center with specific conditions attached, the organization would be put in an impossible position once Zora joined their staff. Alexander set the phone down, a cold anger replacing his earlier uncertainty. Reynolds wasn't simply challenging his leadership based on philosophical differences about the company's direction. He was actively trying to sabotage Alexander's personal life to achieve his professional goals. The question was how to respond. Alexander could try to outbid Reynolds, offering the UJC a larger donation without problematic conditions. But that would inevitably be seen as him using corporate resources to benefit his girlfriend's new employer, exactly the kind of conflict the recusal policy was meant to prevent. He could warn Zora and let her handle it from her end, but that would immediately place her in an adversarial position with her new colleagues before she even started the job. What kind of welcome would she receive if she was perceived as the reason a major donation fell through? Or he could confront Reynolds directly, but that risked escalating a situation that was already precarious after the failed board coup. No easy solutions presented themselves as Alexander stared at the ceiling, acutely aware of Zora's peaceful breathing beside him. For all his business acumen and strategic thinking, he found himself at a loss when it came to protecting both his relationship and his professional integrity. Zora stirred, sensing his tension even in sleep. She turned toward him, her arm draping across his chest as she settled closer against his side. The simple, unconscious gesture of closeness clarified something for Alexander. Whatever challenges they faced, from corporate politics to genuine value conflicts, they would face them together, with the same honesty and mutual respect they'd shown tonight. Whether that would be enough remained to be seen, but it was the only approach that honored what they'd built between them. Alexander made his decision. In the morning, he would tell Zora about Reynolds' meeting with the UJC board member. They would discuss options openly, respecting each other's boundaries and perspectives, and then they would act in accordance with their shared values, transparency, integrity, and a commitment to finding solutions that didn't require either of them to compromise what mattered most. It wouldn't be easy. The forces working to separate them were powerful and determined. But as he finally drifted towards sleep, Alexander took comfort in knowing that what he and Zora had built was worth fighting for. Not just their relationship, but the possibility it represented of bridging worlds that had long been divided. The question that would be answered in the coming days was whether that possibility could withstand the very real pressures now being brought to bear against it. "A $2 million donation," Zora repeated, her coffee cup suspended halfway to her lips, "with the condition that the Urban Justice Center refrains from challenging any Blackwood developments for the next 3 years. Alexander nodded grimly. They sat at his kitchen island the next morning, early sunlight streaming through the windows as he shared Vanessa's message about Reynolds's planned meeting with the UJC board member. "It's a deliberate trap," he explained. "If the UJC accepts, they compromise their mission and your position becomes untenable. If they refuse, Reynolds paints them as unreasonable ideologues who rejected a good-faith effort at cooperation." Zora set down her cup, her expression hardening. "And either way, it creates exactly the kind of conflict that tests the boundaries we discussed last night." "Precisely." Alexander ran a hand through his hair, still disheveled from sleep. "Reynolds is using the UJC to force a situation where my personal and professional interests appear directly opposed. My start date isn't for 2 weeks, Zora mused. Technically, I'm not yet bound by their policies or decisions. But you've accepted the position, Alexander pointed out. Your future colleagues will expect your loyalty. Zora was quiet for a moment, thinking. The Urban Justice Center's mission is protecting community interests, not refusing to work with developers. A blanket non-opposition agreement undermines that mission regardless of the donation amount. I agree, Alexander said, but Reynolds knows that. He's counting on the UJC board seeing dollar signs and compromising their principles. Not if I can help it. Zora reached for her phone. I need to call Eleanor Kim, the executive director. She should know what's happening before the meeting. As Zora stepped onto the balcony to make her call, Alexander checked his own messages. Vanessa had sent an update. Reynolds moved fast. Meeting with UJC board happening this morning, 10 a.m. Alexander glanced at his watch. Just over 2 hours away. Not much time to formulate a counter-strategy. Zora returned, looking both determined and concerned. Eleanor appreciates the heads up. The donation offer came through late yesterday, exactly as Vanessa described. The board was already scheduled to discuss it this morning. How did she react to learning about Reynolds' likely motives? Cautiously, Zora replied. The UJC needs funding, especially for their legal defense work. She can't dismiss a $2 million donation without serious consideration, even knowing it might be a tactical move. Alexander nodded, understanding the dilemma. Non-profits like the UJC perpetually struggled for resources. $2 million could fund numerous community initiatives and legal challenges, just not any involving Blackwood projects. What are you thinking? He asked, recognizing the focused look that meant Zora was formulating a plan. I'm thinking we need to address this head-on, she answered, not just react to Reynolds' move, but reframe the entire situation. How? By offering an alternative that serves both the UJC's mission and Blackwood's legitimate business interests, without compromising either. She began pacing, energy radiating from her movements. What if, instead of a non-opposition agreement, Blackwood established a community benefit fund administered by an independent third party? The fund would support affordable housing, education, and economic development in neighborhoods where Blackwood builds. Alexander considered the idea. It would need to be truly independent to avoid the appearance of buying influence. Exactly, Zora agreed. And participation would need to be voluntary for communities. No strings attached, no expectation that accepting support means accepting development terms. The board would question the business rationale, Alexander noted, though he was already seeing the potential. Why invest millions with no guaranteed return? Because the return isn't in immediate concessions, Zora explained, warming to her concept. It's in long-term relationship building and creating a framework for collaboration rather than confrontation. When communities see developers investing in their priorities without demanding compliance in return, it changes the dynamic entirely. As she outlined her vision, Alexander was struck once again by why he had fallen in love with her. Zora's mind worked in ways his didn't, seeing connections and possibilities where others saw only conflict. She wasn't rejecting business realities. She was expanding them to include community values and long-term sustainability. It's brilliant, he said when she finished, and it completely undercuts Reynolds' play. Instead of forcing a choice between accepting problematic conditions or rejecting needed funding, we're offering a third option that serves everyone's core interests. Not everyone's, Zora cautioned. Reynolds wants to drive a wedge between us and between Blackwood and community organizations. This would do the opposite. Alexander checked the time. The UJC board meets in 90 minutes. We need to move quickly if we want to present this alternative before they vote on Reynolds' offer. I'll call Eleanor again, Zora said. See if she can delay the vote until we can formalize this proposal. As she made the call, Alexander contacted Vanessa, outlining the Community Benefit Fund concept. and asking her to prepare a preliminary framework they could present to the UJC. If anyone could assemble a professional proposal on short notice, it was his CFO. The next hour passed in a flurry of calls and rapid planning. By 9:30, they had the outlines of a formal proposal, a $5 million initial commitment to establish the Blackwood Community Partnership Fund to be administered by a board consisting of equal numbers of community representatives, development experts, and Blackwood appointees. The fund would support projects in neighborhoods where Blackwood was active, but with no requirement that communities supported development plans in return. Eleanor convinced the board to hear our alternative before voting, Zora reported after her third call with the UJC director. But there's a complication. They want both presentations in person, Reynolds and you. Alexander frowned. That puts you in an awkward position as the incoming policy director. I know, Zora acknowledged. But Eleanor thinks my presence would actually strengthen the case for your proposal. It demonstrates transparency about our relationship rather than trying to hide it. Are you comfortable with that? Alexander asked, concerned about how this might affect her standing with her new colleagues. Zora took a deep breath. I'm not going to start this job by hiding from difficult situations. If the board questions my integrity because I'm involved with you, better to address it directly from the beginning. Alexander's admiration for her courage only deepened. Many people would have distanced themselves from the controversy, prioritizing career comfort over honest engagement, not Zora. They arrived at the Urban Justice Center's downtown offices 15 minutes before the scheduled board meeting. The modest building stood in stark contrast to Blackwood's gleaming corporate headquarters, its lobby worn but welcoming, walls covered with photos of community events and framed newspaper articles about successful advocacy campaigns. Eleanor Kim greeted them at the elevator, her petite frame and youthful appearance belying her reputation as one of the city's most formidable social justice attorneys. She shook Alexander's hand with surprising strength. Mr. Blackwood. When Zora mentioned she was seeing someone in real estate development, I confess I didn't imagine the CEO of Blackwood Industries. Her tone was neutral, professional, but reserved. Ms. Kim, thank you for allowing us to present an alternative proposal on such short notice. She nodded briskly. The board values all perspectives, especially when substantial funding is involved. Turning to Zora, her expression softened slightly. The boardroom is this way. Mr. Reynolds arrived a few minutes ago. They followed her down a hallway lined with law books and community organizing manuals. Through the partially open boardroom door, Alexander could see Reynolds in animated conversation with several board members, his thin face arranged in an expression of earnest concern that Alexander knew was entirely calculated. When they entered, Reynolds's carefully composed features registered momentary surprise at seeing them together, quickly masked with a professional smile. Alexander, he said smoothly, this is unexpected. I wasn't aware you had business with the Urban Justice Center today. Martin, Alexander replied with equal poise. I understand you're proposing a donation to the UJC on behalf of Blackwood Industries. As CEO, I thought I should be present for such discussions. A flicker of annoyance crossed Reynolds' face at having his narrative challenged so directly. My proposal comes from the Community Engagement Committee I chair, he clarified, a committee you authorized. With certain parameters, Alexander countered, parameters I believe your current offer exceeds. Eleanor Kim intervened before the corporate tension could escalate further. Gentlemen, the board is ready to hear both presentations. Mr. Reynolds will present first, followed by Mr. Blackwood. Ms. Hayes will then address any questions about potential conflicts of interest given her incoming position with us. The boardroom held a long table surrounded by 12 people of diverse backgrounds and ages, attorneys, community organizers, and former government officials who now guided the UJC's strategic direction. They regarded the corporate visitors with varying degrees of skepticism and interest. Reynolds's presentation was polished and persuasive. He spoke eloquently about Blackwood's commitment to productive dialogue with community organizations, positioning the donation and non-opposition agreement as a foundation for a new relationship rather than a restriction. $2 million could fund 10 major legal challenges, he reminded them. Or it could establish the beginning of a collaborative approach that serves both corporate and community interests. All we ask is a 3-year commitment to engage in good faith dialogue before opposing our projects, a cooling-off period for productive conversation rather than immediate adversarial positioning. Several board members nodded, clearly seeing the practical benefits of the offer despite its obvious constraints. Alexander noted which ones seemed most receptive, mentally preparing to address their specific concerns. When his turn came, Alexander began not with the details of his counter-proposal, but with a direct acknowledgement of the elephant in the room. "I want to start by addressing what I suspect many of you are thinking," he said. "Yes, I'm in a relationship with Zora Hayes, your incoming policy director, and yes, that creates potential conflicts that require careful navigation. But it's also what has helped me understand why organizations like the UJC are essential, not as adversaries to be neutralized, but as necessary voices ensuring development serves communities, not just corporate interests." The directness of his opening seemed to catch the board's attention. Alexander continued, outlining the Community Partnership Fund proposal with an emphasis on its independence and lack of restrictive conditions. "The key difference between our proposals," he concluded, "is that Mr. Reynolds is asking you to limit your advocacy in exchange for funding. I'm suggesting we provide greater funding with no such limitations, creating instead a vehicle for proactive investment in community priorities. The UJC would remain free to challenge any Blackwood project you believe harms community interests. We're betting that collaborative engagement will simply make such challenges less necessary over time." As Alexander finished, he could see that his proposal had resonated with at least some board members. But the real test would come with Zora's contribution. She stood, composed but with a slight tension in her shoulders that only Alexander would notice. "I've spent my career advocating for communities affected by development," she began. "That won't change in my role here at the UJC. I want to address directly any concerns about my relationship with Alexander Blackwood affecting my professional judgment." She paused, meeting the eyes of various board members before continuing. "I believe in the UJC's mission. I would not have accepted this position if I wasn't prepared to uphold that mission with complete integrity, even when it means opposing projects led by Blackwood Industries. Alexander understands and respects this, which is why the fund he's proposing comes with no restrictions on advocacy." One of the board members, an older black woman with silver dreadlocks, leaned forward. "And what happens the first time you need to publicly criticize a Blackwood project, Ms. Hayes? Are we to believe your personal relationship won't be affected?" It was the question at the heart of their ongoing challenge, the one they had wrestled with privately just the night before. "Our relationship will undoubtedly be tested," Zora acknowledged honestly, "but we've committed to navigating those tests with integrity and respect for each other's professional responsibilities. I won't compromise my advocacy, and Alexander doesn't expect me to." "That's easy to say now," Reynolds interjected smoothly, "but when millions of dollars and public reputations are at stake, such noble intentions often falter. My proposal offers clarity and certainty, clear boundaries that protect everyone's interests." Eleanor Kim, who had been observing silently, finally spoke. "The board will need to discuss both proposals privately. Mr. Blackwood, Mr. Reynolds, Ms. Hayes, thank you for your presentations. We'll communicate our decision by the end of the day." As they exited the boardroom, Reynolds approached Alexander, his voice low enough that only the three of them could hear. "Clever counter-move," he said, "but ultimately self-defeating. You've just publicly undermined my authority as a board member and committee chair. The recusal policy won't protect you from the consequences of that." "The recusal policy doesn't prevent me from presenting alternative approaches when committee members exceed their mandate," Alexander replied evenly. And it certainly doesn't require me to stand aside while you use corporate resources to deliberately create conflicts of interest. Reynolds' thin smile didn't reach his eyes. "This isn't over," he said simply, before nodding curtly to Zora and walking away. Outside the UJC building, Alexander and Zora paused on the sidewalk, both processing the morning's events. "That went as well as could be expected," Alexander said, loosening his tie slightly. The board seemed receptive to the fund concept. "Some of them," Zora agreed. "Others still question whether any collaboration with Blackwood is appropriate, regardless of the terms." She looked troubled. "And Reynolds is right about one thing. This isn't over. If anything, we've escalated the situation by directly challenging him." Alexander took her hand, a rare public display of affection given their usual caution about merging their personal and professional lives. After the morning's frank discussions, such distinctions seemed less relevant. "We knew this wouldn't be easy," he said, "but I'd rather face the complications together honestly than let someone like Reynolds dictate the terms of our relationship." Zora squeezed his hand, but her expression remained worried. "The question is whether honesty and good intentions are enough when the structural conflicts are so fundamental." It was a question neither of them could answer with certainty. As they parted ways, Alexander to return to Blackwood headquarters, Zora to meet with community organizers about an unrelated housing issue, the weight of their challenges lingered between them. Both were committed to making their relationship work despite the complications. Both believed in the possibility of bridging their different worlds through mutual respect and innovative approaches like the Community Partnership Fund. But as Reynolds' parting words had made clear, the forces working to separate them were equally determined. The coming days would determine whether love could truly transcend the deep-seated conflicts between corporate power and community advocacy, or whether some divisions were simply too fundamental to overcome, regardless of personal feelings. The Urban Justice Center's board voted 7-5 to accept Alexander's Community Partnership Fund proposal over Reynolds's restricted donation. The decision, while gratifying, sent ripples through both Alexander and Zora's professional worlds. At Blackwood Industries, Reynolds moved quickly to portray the outcome as evidence of exactly what he had warned against: Alexander using company resources to benefit his girlfriend's organization without adequate business justification. At the UJC, despite the board's approval, several staff members questioned whether any collaboration with Blackwood Industries compromised their advocacy mission. The weeks that followed tested Alexander and Zora's commitment to navigating their complex relationship. Zora began her position as policy director, immediately diving into campaigns that sometimes placed her in opposition to development projects, though none yet directly involving Blackwood. Alexander focused on implementing the Community Partnership Fund with the independence and transparency he had promised, appointing respected community leaders and development experts to its governing board. On a rainy Tuesday evening, 2 months after the UJC board decision, Alexander sat in his office reviewing quarterly results. Blackwood Industries' performance remained strong, with the Riverside development proceeding on schedule and within budget. The Community Partnership Fund had made its first round of grants, supporting affordable housing initiatives and job training programs in 3 neighborhoods where Blackwood had active projects. A knock at his door interrupted his review. Diana entered without waiting for a response, her expression unreadable as she took a seat across from him. "The board meeting tomorrow is going to be challenging," she said without preamble. "Reynolds has been lobbying members individually. He's built a coalition against you." Alexander set aside his reports. "On what grounds this time?" "The Community Partnership Fund, primarily. He's arguing that the $5 million commitment was made without proper board consultation and represents an inappropriate use of company resources to benefit your personal interests." "The fund benefits communities where we build," Alexander pointed out. "It's creating goodwill that will ultimately make our projects more successful." "I know that," Diana replied. but Reynolds is framing it as the beginning of a pattern where your relationship with Zora Hayes compromises your business judgment. Alexander leaned back in his chair, studying his cousin. And where do you stand in all this? Diana met his gaze directly. I'm still undecided. The admission surprised him. After you intervened to save my position last time? That was before you committed $5 million to a fund that partners with an organization employing your girlfriend. She leaned forward. Alexander, I support your vision for more community-engaged development, but the optics of this particular situation are exactly what the recusal policy was meant to prevent. I didn't violate the policy, Alexander insisted. The fund is independent, and Zora has no direct control over its decisions. Technically, perhaps, but in spirit? Diana shook her head. You need to decide what matters more to you, running Blackwood Industries or your relationship with Zora Hayes. Because Reynolds is forcing a choice, and tomorrow may be the tipping point. After she left, Alexander sat in silence, rain streaming down the windows of his office. His phone buzzed with a message from Zora. Dinner tonight? Have news to share. My place at 8? He responded, grateful for the chance to see her despite the looming board confrontation. When Zora arrived at his penthouse that evening, Alexander could immediately sense something had changed. She seemed both energized and troubled, a combination he had come to recognize when she was wrestling with a major decision. What's the news? He asked, after greeting her with a kiss. Zora took a deep breath. The UJC is filing a legal challenge against the East Side redevelopment project. Alexander stilled. The East Side project was one of Blackwood's largest upcoming developments, a mixed-use complex that would transform a formerly industrial area. While not as directly impactful on existing communities as the Riverside development had been, it still raised questions about gentrification and affordable housing that had prompted community concerns. On what grounds? He asked, his voice carefully neutral. Environmental impact assessments that underestimate pollution effects on adjacent low-income neighborhoods, inadequate affordable housing commitments, and insufficient community consultation, Zora listed. The legal team believes there are grounds for at least delaying the project until these issues are addressed. Alexander absorbed this, aware that they had reached the moment they had both anticipated and dreaded, the point where their professional responsibilities placed them in direct opposition. I'm recused from any decisions involving the UJC, he said finally. The response will come from the executive committee, not me personally. I know, Zora replied, watching him carefully. But that doesn't change the reality that I'll be publicly opposing a major Blackwood project. The press will have a field day with the personal angle. Let them, Alexander said, moving to pour them both a glass of wine. We've been transparent about the potential for this situation from the beginning. Zora accepted the wine but didn't drink. There's more. I'm going to be the public face of this challenge. I'll be giving interviews, speaking at community meetings, potentially testifying if it goes to court. The implications were immediate and significant. Reynolds would undoubtedly use this development to fuel his argument that Alexander's relationship created untenable conflicts for the company. Shareholders might question whether Blackwood's interests were being properly protected. The carefully constructed barriers between their personal and professional lives would be publicly tested in ways they couldn't control. I understand, Alexander said, finding that he truly did. This is your job, your responsibility. It doesn't make it easier, Zora admitted, setting down her untouched wine. Alexander, the timing couldn't be worse. Diana called me today. This was unexpected. Diana? What did she want? To warn me, Zora said. She told me about Reynolds's coalition, about the board meeting tomorrow. She suggested that my relationship with you was putting your leadership at risk. Alexander frowned. Diana has never shown any particular concern for our relationship before. She hasn't, Zora agreed, which is why I think this wasn't just a friendly heads-up. She wanted me to know exactly what's at stake before the UJC announced the East Side Challenge. The calculation behind Diana's move was clear. She was pressuring Zora, hoping she might delay or moderate the UJC's opposition to protect Alexander's position. It was manipulative but effective, judging by the conflict evident in Zora's expression. The UJC board has already approved the legal challenge, Zora continued, but I could recuse myself from leading it, hand it off to another staff attorney. Is that what you want? Alexander asked, though he already knew the answer. Zora met his gaze directly. No, this project embodies exactly the issues I was hired to address. Stepping back because of our relationship would compromise my professional integrity and the trust the UJC placed in me. Alexander moved closer, taking her hands in his. Then don't step back. We knew this day would come. We'll handle it like we've handled everything else, honestly, respectfully, and with the understanding that our professional disagreements don't define our personal relationship. And if it costs you your position at Blackwood? Zora asked, voicing the question that hung between them. The possibility had been circling Alexander's thoughts since Diana's visit. If Reynolds succeeded in turning the board against him, he could lose control of the company he had built from nothing, his life's work, his mother's legacy, the vehicle through which he had intended to create lasting change. Then I'll find another way to pursue the vision that matters to me, he said with a certainty that surprised them both. Blackwood Industries is important to me, but it's not the only path. Zora studied him, seeming to search for any hesitation behind his words. I don't want to be the reason you lose something that matters so deeply to you. If I lose Blackwood because I refuse to compromise on building a more balanced, community-responsive company, that's not on you, Alexander replied. That's a reflection of a corporate system that still prioritizes short-term profit over long-term sustainability and ethical practice. They stood together in his kitchen, the rain still streaming down the windows, creating a cocoon of intimacy despite the professional storm gathering around them. In that moment, Alexander realized how profoundly his priorities had shifted since meeting Zora. The prospect of losing control of Blackwood still pained him, but it no longer terrified him the way it once would have. Stay tonight? He asked simply. Yes, she answered, equally simply. Later, lying together in the darkness of his bedroom, Zora voiced the question that had been forming between them. Where do we go from here, Alexander? If tomorrow's board meeting goes against you, if the East Side Challenge creates the public controversy we're expecting, what happens to us? He considered his answer carefully, wanting to be honest without adding to her burden. I think we keep doing what we've been doing, navigating each challenge as it comes, respecting each other's boundaries and responsibilities, finding creative solutions where we can. And when we can't find those solutions, she pressed, when the conflicts are irreconcilable, then we make the hard choices together, he said. But Zora, I don't believe our fundamental values are as opposed as the systems we work within make them seem. We both want development that serves communities rather than displacing them. We both believe in balancing profit with purpose. We're just approaching those goals from different directions. She turned to face him in the darkness, her hand finding his. I believe that too, but I'm not sure the world is ready for what we're trying to build between us. The vulnerability in her voice matched his own feelings precisely. They were attempting something that defied conventional categories and expectations, a relationship that bridged divides most people considered unbridgeable. Then we'll help the world catch up, Alexander said, though he understood the naivety such confidence might seem to suggest. Starting with tomorrow's board meeting. What will you tell them? Zora asked. The truth, he replied, that I believe Blackwood Industries can evolve to be both profitable and responsible, that the Community Partnership Fund represents that evolution, and that my personal relationship with you has helped me see opportunities I might have missed, but hasn't compromised my commitment to the company's success. And if that's not enough, "Then I'll leave knowing I stood for something I believe in," Alexander said, "and we'll figure out what comes next together." The board meeting the next day unfolded much as Diana had warned. Reynolds presented a detailed case against Alexander's leadership, focusing particularly on the Community Partnership Fund as evidence of compromised judgment. The coalition he had built included several key board members, including Chairman Harmon. When Alexander's turn to respond came, he spoke with a clarity and conviction that surprised even his closest allies. "Blackwood Industries stands at a crossroads," he began. "We can continue pursuing development that maximizes short-term profit at the expense of community relationships and sustainable growth. Or we can evolve into a company that balances profit with purpose, that sees communities as partners rather than obstacles." He addressed the criticisms of the Community Partnership Fund directly, presenting data on improved community relations and expedited approvals for projects in neighborhoods where the fund had invested. "My relationship with Zora Hayes has been presented as a liability," he continued. "I see it differently. Through Zora, I've gained insights into community perspectives that have made me a more effective leader, one who recognizes that truly successful development requires engagement, not imposition." As the debate continued, Alexander noticed Diana watching him with an unreadable expression. When the time came for board members to speak, she requested the floor. "My cousin and I have not always seen eye to eye on the direction of this company," she began. "I've been skeptical of his recent emphasis on community engagement, concerned that it might dilute our focus on shareholder returns." Reynolds nodded along, clearly expecting Diana's support for his position. "However," she continued, "the results speak for themselves. The Riverside development, despite its community accommodations, remains on track to deliver returns within our target range. The Community Partnership Fund has reduced opposition to 3 other projects, potentially saving millions in legal and delay costs." Diana turned to face Reynolds directly. "This isn't about protecting Blackwood's interests. This is about a fundamental disagreement over what kind of company we should be. And on that question, I find myself aligning with Alexander's vision, not yours." Her unexpected support shifted the boardroom dynamics. The final vote was 8-6 in Alexander's favor, a narrow margin that reflected the genuine divisions within the company, but a victory nonetheless. As board members filed out, Diana approached Alexander. "Don't mistake this for unconditional support," she said, echoing her words from months before. "I still have concerns about your relationship with Zora, especially with this East Side challenge looming, but I believe your vision for Blackwood is the right one for the future." "Thank you," Alexander said sincerely, "for seeing beyond the immediate conflicts to the longer-term potential." "Just be careful," Diana warned. "Today's victory doesn't mean the questions about conflicts of interest are resolved. If anything, they'll intensify once the UJC challenge becomes public." She was right, of course. The coming weeks and months would bring new tests, new moments where Alexander and Zora's professional responsibilities would pull them in opposing directions. There would be public scrutiny, private doubts, and no guarantee that their relationship could withstand the pressures. But as Alexander left the boardroom, he felt a certainty that had been building since that first meeting with Zora in his office hallway. Whatever challenges lay ahead, the journey they had begun together, the bridge they were building between their different worlds, was worth the struggle. That evening he met Zora at her community center where she was helping teenagers with college applications. The same work she had been doing the day they first met. She looked up when he entered, a question in her eyes. "I'm still CEO," he said simply. Her smile of genuine happiness for him confirmed what he already knew, that despite the professional conflicts that would continue to arise, they shared a deeper connection founded on mutual respect and a common vision of what the world could be. "And the UJC is still challenging the East Side project," she reminded him, though her tone held no apology. "As they should if there are legitimate concerns," Alexander acknowledged. "Blackwood will respond. The process will unfold and we'll learn from it, both professionally and personally." As he joined her at the table, helping a young man format his personal statement, Alexander reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. They had started as representatives of opposing worlds, corporate power and community advocacy, each viewing the other with skepticism. Now they were partners in something more complex and meaningful, a relationship that didn't erase their different perspectives and responsibilities, but created space for both to exist honestly. It wasn't perfect. It would continue to face challenges, both external and internal. But it was authentic in a way few relationships ever achieved, built on seeing and accepting each other completely, contradictions and all. The most desired CEO in the city had indeed fallen in love with the only black woman who wanted nothing from him. And in doing so, both had found something neither had been looking for, a connection that transcended the boundaries that normally separated their worlds, and the courage to imagine new possibilities for themselves and the communities they both, in their different ways, sought to serve. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was something better. A beginning, complicated and challenging and real, with the promise of growth and evolution still to come. And for two people who valued honesty above easy comfort, that was exactly as it should be. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Just click on the screen.